All right, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the first iteration of our 2023 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference virtual workshop series on low carbon energy transitions, lessons learned from global Pathfinders. I'm Gwen Holdman. I'm the founding director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which is also the primary sponsor for this event workshop series, and I am going to be your MC for this first event. Thank you for joining us. The Alaska Center for Energy and Power is an applied energy research program that was founded at the University of Alaska Fairbanks about 15 years ago with a mission of supporting Alaskan communities and industries and really navigating our own energy transitions. We're largely engineering based and tend to focus most often on technology or system solutions, but we're also really interested in policies and programs that can support adoption of cost-effective local energy solutions for Alaskans. And we think that this is ultimately important because you can engineer systems to work in a particular location or a community, but there's lots of examples here in Alaska of communities that are already doing that, that have been really forward-thinking and innovative in developing energy systems or solutions, whether that's Kotzebue as really a pioneer in wind energy, or Golden Valley here in Fairbanks, where I am, that really installed one of the first large-scale energy storage systems. They're best here long before that was as prolific as the technology is today. But to really move the needle in a big way, we can't just do these one-off solutions. There has to be really a more concerted and organized effort to shift in a new direction as a society. And that's what we're here to learn about today on this with these series of case studies and this workshop on low carbon energy transitions. So I'm going to give a quick overview. This is the first of 3 virtual workshops that are going to be held monthly as 2 half-day Zoom sessions, just like we're doing today, free of charge, leading up to the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, which is happening in person May 22nd through the 25th at the Denina Center in Anchorage, Alaska. I hope a lot of you are able to join us for that in-person event as well. For these workshops, we've made an effort to really pick topics that we think deserve a bit of a deeper dive than what we can accomplish in sort of the compressed format of the larger Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, and that are really relevant or timely based on things that are happening or discussions that are occurring around the state of Alaska right now. And so in addition to this first workshop on energy transitions, we're holding one next month in April on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That's really designed to be a reality check about that suite of technologies that sort of fall under that CCS umbrella and that are broken down into like 3 primary areas of focus: the carbon capture piece, whether that's point source or direct air capture, transportation, and then storage in the context of what's really possible in the state of Alaska. And then the third workshop in this series is going to be on long duration energy storage, or really just energy storage beyond lithium-ion batteries. That's what we're calling it. And those lithium-ion batteries are really what a lot of the current focus is on, whether that's in the EV market or for utility scale storage. And so we're interested in what sorts of storage opportunities are coming up beyond that, because storage is such a critical enabling technology for energy transitions, especially as they relate to integration of variable renewables such as wind or solar on our grid. And so we want to understand what sorts of options are available on the horizon, and we think that this is something that's also of interest to Alaskans. I also want to mention that there were 4 workshops that were really similar in format that we sponsored in 2022, and those are still accessible online. I think we're going to drop a link to those in the chat here, and those included one on nuclear microreactors, one on hydrogen, beneficial electrification, and tidal energy, which are, also all still pretty relevant today. So that link will be in the chat. And really our goal for all of these has been to bring together some of the top experts and practitioners so that we can present these workshops with that sort of subject matter expertise, but with a little bit of an Alaska spin to it, or at least, hear from speakers that we think has information that's relevant to an Alaskan audience. And so this particular workshop is about stories and narratives about energy transitions that 3 countries, Iceland, France, and Denmark, and in one state, Hawaii, have navigated, and in most cases are really continuing to navigate today. It's not just a one and done sort of thing. And so we're going to learn really about the why, the how, the what, and the when of these energy transitions. Like, why did they start on this path that they did? What were the underlying drivers? How did they go about this? What role did things like national policy or innovation and technology development play in helping navigate those transitions? And then what sorts of stumbling blocks or headwinds did they navigate? And what lessons could Alaska learn from those experiences? We picked these countries because we think there are very specific and relevant aspects to their stories that can be applied here in Alaska, and we hope to explore those aspects together through the course of this workshop. We picked both the speakers and the moderators because of their deep knowledge and expertise in these particular energy transitions, or their specific knowledge related to some aspect of that particular nation or that technology. And I'm pretty excited because this is a workshop where we actually had the luck of almost everyone that we invited that was our first choice to come and speak actually accepted the invitation and are going to be joining us today. I'm particularly appreciative of our European colleagues who are joining us in most cases really late in the evening their time, taking away from their time away from their families to join this conversation with us over the next couple of days. All right, so here's the agenda for today. I'm just going to go over this quickly. In your attendee packet that you've received, I think, multiple times over the last week or so, you should have received bios and a more detailed agenda with the speakers for each of the topics. But I just wanted to review this quickly today. We're going to start out with this presentation from Kathy Arroyo, who I will introduce here in a little bit, and then move into some narratives about Iceland, both from Halla Logastóttir, who is the director of their National Energy Authority and somebody that I consider a friend and I've known for many, many years, is going to be talking about the Iceland energy transition. And then we're going to hear from Erlinger Gudleifsson a little bit about what that meant in terms of small business and economic development around a couple of key sort of areas. And so that's where we're going to start. And then later on a little bit later this morning, we're going to hear from the director of the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, Rick Rochelo, who's going to tell us a little bit about the direction that Hawaii has been going with incorporating higher and higher levels of, in particular, distributed solar energy, but also, all kinds of different renewables that they've been working on there. And so that's kind of a rundown for the first day. And then the second day, we'll continue that conversation. I won't go into a ton of detail, but basically tomorrow we're going to be hearing about the French transition that is really centered around nuclear energy, the nuclear industry, and then follow that up with hearing a little bit about Denmark and their transition related to wind energy. We're going to wrap up the entire workshop with a discussion around what this all means for Alaska. So we've got a panel of folks that we're going to bring together at the end of the day tomorrow to really hear a little bit about what lessons Alaska can really take away from these particular case studies. So before we get started, and the ones that have participated in this workshop previously know that we tend to do this, let's take a look at where everyone is joining us from. So I'd like to switch to this participation poll. From your computer, you can just go to this pollev.com/TOTTAK216. I guess we recommend using Google Chrome for the best results. And so that link is also in the chat. So we're going to be using the chat pretty heavily here. You can just go ahead and click on that. If you're participating by phone, you can text that same TOTTAK216 to 22333. And you're going to receive a text message once you've joined the session, and then you can type in and send your response, and the results are going to pop up on the next screen. Basically, we're looking at you to sort of drop your pin on the map here. We have a bigger map of Alaska right now. So if you're from Alaska, pick your community. And then if you're either from the lower 48 or from outside of the US, we'd like to see that as well. So we can go ahead and see where folks are participating from today. I do see, Gretchen, that I see your question in the chat. Can we receive a link to this recording through email? There will be a recording that's provided for this entire workshop that will be available at a later date, hopefully not too far out. And we are really not going to be using that Q&A that you used here. I think that what we're hoping is that everyone will use just a chat function that'll be a little bit easier. And with that being said, please go ahead and just introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and the organization you're from. We'd really like to hear from you, especially since our virtual map isn't working. And then during the presentations, just like I just said, just go ahead and submit questions using the chat, not the Q&A function. And don't worry about distracting our moderators. If you're coming up with questions, just drop them right in there. Our moderators are really going to be pulling those questions together and kind of curating them, so the speakers aren't going to be distracted if you're using that chat during the middle of their presentation. Don't worry about that. If you're having any kind of difficulties with audio or trouble viewing the presentation, go and chat to the event support for assistance, so that you can just kind of select them. Okay. And event support is telling me that it's up. So let's take a look at this really quickly. And so I'll just kind of finish like that last just kind of housekeeping bit of information that the recording is going to be available on the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website. Again, at a later date, we don't know exactly where, but we will send out an email notifying everyone that's participated or that registered for this particular event, so that you know it's there when it is. Looks like we have a lot of folks from Alaska, from Anchorage, a couple from, am I like the only person here from Fairbanks? I find that hard to believe, but we got Sitka and a few other places as well. Looks like Kotzebue. And then we've actually got a lot of folks from outside of Alaska. So that's kind of exciting. That's exciting to see. It looks like we've got about 5 or so. So anyway, yeah, thanks for participating. We're always looking for feedback too. We're going to have a poll at the end of the workshop, looking for feedback, because we want to keep on having these sorts of opportunities that are relevant, timely, on topic, and presenting some of the best information that we can to our audience. So thank you for joining us today. And I guess with no further ado, I would like to introduce the governor. Mike Dunleavy has some opening remarks. He has really been the architect behind the brainchild behind the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. And so we're really excited that he took the time to prepare some remarks. And then we're going to have John Espandola, who's the special assistant to the governor, and also the lead for the newly formed Office of Energy Innovation within the governor's office, sort of showing the importance that the governor is placing on this, to talk a little bit about the governor's vision and a little bit more about this recently announced energy security task force. And so thank you. Let's go to the governor's message.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the first Alaskan Sustainable Energy Conference pre-event workshop on energy transitions. One of the reasons we launched the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference last year was to begin a conversation with Alaskans about our energy future in the context of a changing global energy landscape. Alaska's lucky. We're rich in energy resources. Everyone knows Alaska as an oil state, but we also have incredible potential with tidal, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal energy as well. When it comes to energy, you name it, Alaska's got it. We are at a pivotal time for charting the path we will take to provide Alaska's energy. That's why I created the Alaska Energy Security Task Force. The task force will engage both Alaskans and industry experts to develop an energy plan for Alaska. Learning from other countries that have invested in alternative energy options that make use of their particular geography and resources is a good place for us to start. Where we can learn from others, we should do so. France with nuclear energy, Iceland with geothermal, and Denmark with wind each have lessons for all of us. Ultimately, Alaska will chart a path that is uniquely Alaskan. The Alaska Energy Security Task Force will work with my administration to develop a plan that works for all of us. I hope you enjoyed today's workshop, and I look forward to you joining me in Anchorage in May for the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. Good luck.
Good morning. My name is John Espandola, and I lead the Governor's Office of Energy Innovation. I'm also part of the team working on building Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference this year to be as successful as last year's event. I want to say a special thank you to the University of Alaska Fairbanks and ASEP for again sponsoring this series of workshops leading up to the Governor's Sustainable Energy Conference. This first workshop will explore the concepts other nations have embraced as they moved to decarbonize their energy systems. For Alaska, the energy transition happening in front of our eyes isn't just about decarbonization. What this will do for the entire state is lower the cost of energy throughout the state with secure sources of sustainable energy. With the recent announcement of AO 344, the Alaska Energy Security Task Force, this is a phenomenal time for the entire state of Alaska as all Alaskans are coalescing around all things energy. The task force will take an in-depth analysis on several topics such as establishing a baseline energy portfolio for the state, identifying solutions for meeting Alaska's energy needs now and in the future, identifying policies, programs, and regulatory changes and funding opportunities that could accelerate the adoption of these energy strategies. We'll be developing a public database with information through an energy data portal, and we'll also be recommending a statewide energy goal. Thank you again, and I look forward to learning more from the presenters. And now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Alaska Energy Authority, Curtis Thayer.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Gwen and John for the preview this morning. And I serve as the Executive Director of the Alaska Energy Authority. And the Alaska Energy Authority was created 46 years ago with a simple mission of lowering the cost of energy in Alaska. We've enjoyed a partnership with ASEP during that time, and obviously with the governor's office and the legislature as we look at doing this. And the Sustainability Conference, as previously said, was really the brainchild of Governor Dunleavy. And with that, we hope to build on that success and expand it this year. One thing that we do is large infrastructure projects as well as small infrastructure projects. We focus on energy independence, security, and sustainability. To achieve these objectives, AEA is developing a low carbon energy solutions across Alaska, targeting goals for energy efficiency, the security, reducing the costs and carbon emissions, increasing the investment of clean energy and resources. In rural Alaska, we focus on over a little less than 200 small rural villages, less than 200 people. And with that, we construct bulk fuel tank and diesel powerhouses. Now, diesel powerhouses and clean energy, they don't necessarily go together. But one thing to do is we try to aim at efficiencies for these communities, as well as introducing renewables. And some of these communities in rural Alaska are 100% renewable, whether that be biomass, primarily hydro, and introducing solar and wind to that. We have already built 100 bulk fuel projects and over 90 powerhouses. On the rail belt, which is interconnected electrical grid, which stretches 700 miles from Fairbanks to Anchorage to the Kenai Peninsula, AEA owns generation and transmission assets. About 70% of Alaska's population is served by the electric system. AEA owns the 120 megawatt Bradley Hydro Project, an important generating facility on the rail belt. It produces 10% of the total annual electricity on the rail belt at the cheapest rate of 4.5 cents. It is used by more than 450,000 Alaskans, or equivalently, it produces power for 54,000 homes. To optimize the value of our transmission, AEA and its utility partners are investing $166 million in transmission lines and installing battery storage system. It's really just the start of a hundreds of millions of dollars, but it is the first step. But the goal is to reduce the constraints off the rail belt off Kenai transmission from Bradley, and to enable the integration of additional renewable energy generation. In addition to these enhancements, AE is also studying the Dixon Diversion Project, which would be the largest hydro development project on the Kenai, or actually in the state of Alaska, since Bradley was brought online over 30 years ago. The proposed project is just located 5 miles from Bradley Lake, and it's 27 miles north of Homer. We would hope that it produces somewhere between 48 to 28,000 homes, increasing the Bradley output by almost 50%. Over its lifetime, the project is expected to create significant job opportunities, construction, and operations. As far as a statewide facility, we look to the IIJ, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's over $60 million targeted for rail belt and over $70 million targeted for rural Alaska. Primarily, the resilience is for relocating power lines, improvements for grid resistance, increasing fire resistance, where we had 2 fires on the Kenai Peninsula, one north of Anchorage in the same year, and also to look at microgrids and energy storage. Also, Alaska electric vehicle. Alaska is undergoing a transition towards electrification. AEA and the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation and Energy to deploy and implement Alaska's infrastructure plan. That's going to unleash $52 million for charging stations in Alaska, $19 million this year alone, of which we've already we have already put out looking for site locations between Anchorage and Fairbanks. We hope to have this be a continuing on-living document as far as the plan is concerned, not only when we get to Fairbanks, but looking at the Kenai Peninsula, also Tok, Delta, and the Marine Highway system as a way to electrify that. And then renewable energy. AEA is unique that we have a renewable energy fund. Over $300 million has been invested by the state, and Governor Dunleavy himself has pushed for $20 million in the last 18 months, which funds 38 projects. These projects span across all regions of the state at various phases, whether it be reconnaissance, whether it be feasibility, or whether we look at actual construction of projects, and primarily all designed towards the renewable field. And over 80% of this funding goes to rural Alaska. Currently, we have multiple hydro, solar, storage, and wind projects. Matter of fact, last year alone, we have 11 wind projects out of those 27 grants in round 14. We also have a power project fund, which again is a unique revolving loan fund where we provide affordable loan funds for early and late stage energy projects, including reconnaissance and feasibility. And for those that are seeking low cost financing, patient capital, our current interest rate is less than 5% on those loans. And our success stories, whether it be Halungnai, which is one of the largest hydro projects in Southeast Alaska, it is the newest one. Prince of Wales Island has taken it almost 90% renewable. And a couple other success stories is we helped fund the Houston solar farm and the Willow solar farm north of Anchorage. The Houston farm, we've committed almost $5 million towards. And it is going to produce 8.5 megawatts, the largest solar farm in Alaska. So when we look at AEA and we look at what we're trying to do with Alaska, we're partnering together. And whether it be with the university or whether it be with our university partners, we realize that we need to accomplish this together. And with the governor and the task force, we hope to identify even more opportunity that we have in Alaska. And at this point, I look forward to turning it back over to Gwen and the continuation of today's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Curtis, John, and Governor Dunleavy. So before we dive into our first panel, I just have another quick poll that I'd like to ask you guys to participate in. We're just going to show this on screen. It's the same as before. The link is in the chat. So you just go to your ideally Chrome web browser and then type in pollellev.com/TOTTAK216 or text that TOTTAK216 to 22333 to participate. And so the question that's popping up on the screen, I think right now, is what sector do you represent? Academia, government, private sector, nonprofit, the utility industry, or something else. So we're going to see that in live time here. All right. Okay, well, that's pretty exciting. I'm super glad to see so many folks from the private sector here joining today. I've been tracking the chat a little bit, and I'm seeing organizations that I am not that familiar with that are joining us today. So that's really fantastic. I actually am quite curious to hear how folks learned about this. We want to make sure that we're getting the word out and that people that are interested in these sorts of topics are able to participate. So if you can kind of help us with that by filling out the poll at the end of the workshop, that would be really fantastic. We would appreciate that. So I'm going to just go ahead right now and jump right into our first presentation. And this is titled Opportunities and Lessons Learned in Energy Transitions. And you know, we're not going to be actually answering questions after this first presentation. Kathy's going to be participating through the entire workshop, more or less, as her schedule allows. And then she's going to be joining us during a roundtable tomorrow. And that's really where I'm hoping that we will have the opportunity to really ask her some questions. So our first presenter, Kathy Arroyo. I'm so bad, Kathy, at your name. I'm so sorry about that. I have it in my head wrong. So is the director of the Center for Advanced Energy Systems Energy Policy Institute and an associate professor at Boise State, and really the lead of this Policy Energy Institute for this center. And the thing about Kathy that I would really like to single out is that she is really the inspiration behind this entire workshop. 3 of the 4 case studies that we are hearing from over the course of the next 2 days are really inspired by the book that she wrote a few years ago on low carbon energy transitions, titled Turning Points in National Policy and Innovation. And I first met Kathy when she was doing research for this book, and I was in Iceland studying as an Arctic Fulbright scholar. Kathy was there doing this research for her book, and we had a chance to meet each other then, and she's been somebody that I have reconnected with at several different points. She's got a real depth and breadth of information. And so what I really was hoping that she would do today is sort of provide like sort of that context and set like sort of that basis from which the conversations over the next 2 days can really flow. And so thank you, Kathy, not only for your participation today, but you've been really working with me and the team to help design this workshop over the last few months. And I know how busy you are. And so I really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your schedule, and also just your general interest in Alaska. I know you've been up here a couple times over the last 6 to 8 months, and that you continue to be interested in Alaska and how we are navigating this current energy transition you're in. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you for this 2-day event. I want to extend my warm thanks to Governor Dunleavy and his team, especially to Gwen and the wonderful organizers, Sarah and Carla, for bringing us all together to advance our thinking about energy transitions. I've worked on this topic for years, as Gwen mentioned, and more recently, really had the pleasure of getting to know Alaska more for its beauty, its people, and the incredible set of energy choices that lie before it. The changes that are occurring with energy and those that we choose to make are at the center of this event. So let's get started. Next slide, please. We're going to begin by defining what energy transitions are. And there are a host of definitions out there as this field evolves. We may hear more, but kind of how is a working definition for us? It's a considerable shift in the nature or pattern of how energy is used within a system. It can include the type, the quantity or quality of how energy is sourced, delivered, or utilized. It can be a planned or an unplanned change. It may encompass the emergence and decline of an energy industry. It also generally includes geopolitical, economic, social, and ecological factors that connect the various stages of utilization. Next slide, please. Now, one way to think about this is that in essence, we're always evolving, and that evolution is a series of replacements. So with energy, there are broad changes happening that were not even imagined just a decade ago. These include how the markets and regulatory environment is evolving, how systems are owned and operated, how the architecture functions, and basically the way the supply, costs, fuel prices, and demand are interacting. Next slide. But if we take a deeper step back and look at a longer view of global primary energy of more than 150 years, we can see that there clearly have been major shifts in the profile of our supply. And this was occurring as we increased our consumption by more than a factor of 20. Next slide. Now, shrinking the window a little bit to just a century ago, the energy supply was based largely on coal and biomass at the time. Industries like those associated with automobiles, gas turbines, the power sector, and aircrafts were still just emerging. And with cars alone at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an intense competition underway between the tech options for internal combustion engines, electric vehicles, and biofuel-powered vehicles that were locked in, or the result was that the internal combustion engine was locked in for about 100 years. Now, interestingly, today, with technology and priorities changing somewhat, another competition is underway, once again, with automobiles, largely between the internal combustion engine and EVs. Next slide, please. That brings us to the forces at work today. We're seeing extreme weather events, which in planning and risk terms used to be factored as 100-year events or extremely rare occurrences. And they are now happening with much greater frequency, oftentimes several times within 10 years. We also have resource limits, a shifting population to urban centers, and digitalization, all driving change. Next slide. That brings us squarely to today, where about 80% of our global primary energy is fossil fuel. The world population is steadily growing and expected to reach 9 billion before mid-century. Environmental stresses, including air quality, are redrawing our maps. We're also talking a lot more about resilience and security as geopolitics, price volatility, and blackouts remind us our systems are not immune to disruption. Next slide. Recently, policies were put in place in many regions to protect millions of unemployed people from power shutoffs. As markets navigate new conditions, it's also not unprecedented now to hear about negative energy prices, a phenomenon that business school textbooks probably never imagined until recently. We're also seeing cyber and physical attacks on energy infrastructure. Who could forget the May 2021 ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, for example, which started with a simple exposed password that enabled the compromise of oil delivery across roughly 5,500 miles of pipeline, representing nearly half of the East Coast supply. Who also could forget the extensive outages in Texas in February 2021, where the delivery systems and nearly the entire range of fuel supplies froze. Today, we're also hearing regularly about the new geopolitical race for critical minerals like graphite, lithium, and cobalt. Next slide, please. Naturally, the past year has been unforgettable. Russia's aggression in Ukraine exacerbated existing pressures and caused incredible human costs. The war triggered unprecedented global energy flux, with layers of curtailments and sanctions on Russian energy exports, adding strain to the already heavily stressed global supply chains. We've seen record spot prices for natural gas, and more than $500 billion committed by governments to protect consumers from these impacts. International trade has been reorienting around new drivers, and countless energy plans have been dusted off and been reevaluated. Next slide, please. That brings us to this two-day event. Alaska is at a crossroad with numerous choices about its energy future and what they could look like. You'll be hearing from experts about Iceland and its geothermal hub, Hawaii's recent shift towards solar energy, France's nuclear history and leadership, and Denmark's global wind industry. Each of these strategies involves bold choices and some uncertainty. Now, in the case of the three country transitions, considerable change was achieved in less than 15 years as globally ranked industries emerged and costs became competitive. These countries also experienced notable improvements in the human development measured by health, education, and life expectancy. Next slide. So to situate you a little better with these examples that will be discussed, here's a snapshot of early and later stage profiles. Frank Carré will be taking us through France's nuclear transition, where the electricity mix pivoted from about 4% in 1970 to about 75% by 1990, and it now stands at roughly 69% of the overall electricity mix. We'll also be hearing from David Rudolph about the Danish wind transition. In 1970, the power mix there used a negligible share of wind power, and today represents about half the national power profile. Denmark's extraordinary story includes days where wind power today equals more than 100% of its electricity demand. Next, Rick Rocheleau will shed light for us on Hawaii, a state like Alaska with some of the highest electricity prices in the country. In Hawaii, solar adoption is underway, reflecting what might be called an early energy transition. In 1970, solar power in the state was negligible, and today is at roughly 7%. Finally, for Iceland's geothermal transition, which impacts not only power but heat, we'll learn about the shift from about 30% to 70% of its primary energy mix with Hala Logisdóttir, and additional insights on electrification and the port of Reykjavik with Erlingir Gudleifsson. Next slide, please. Now, as you listen to the discussion about Denmark's transition, bear in mind it is a global leader in wind technology, and that this shift occurred alongside other transitions like that from centralized energy that you can see represented in the lower left-hand map to a highly distributed system. Next slide. As Denmark advances with its wind power, it has continued to innovate, not only with fundamental wind turbine models themselves that we'll be hearing about, but with grid management practices that smooth variability across the region. Now, as you think about co-benefits, keep in mind that countries like Denmark also pioneered without knowing all the outcomes. The Danish offshore wind farm that is shown here was the largest of its kind in 2000. If you visit the country today, you can often see Middelgruden as you fly in. It is 3.5 kilometers outside of Copenhagen in the shape of an arc along Denmark's historic maritime protection zone. It's also one of the country's top tourist attractions. Now, as we think about feasibility and impacts, know that the Danes transitioned with scientific studies before and after installation of offshore wind farms, showing that with minor disruption for construction, artificial reefs have emerged to foster a strong marine life around the system. And when you consider ownership approaches to energy projects, know that half of Middelgruden, this wind farm pictured here, is owned by about 10,000 shareholders in the community, and the other half is owned by the municipal utility. So people can look out their windows and see clean energy being produced, knowing that they're contributing to a healthy environment and earning revenue. So as we explore questions about learning as we go, also keep in mind that the Danes use codes of practice and design review as a two-way learning channel to improve the technology. Next slide, please. Turning to Iceland, we'll hear about many factors that have enabled its geothermal hub to emerge and thrive. I've often heard people say that Iceland is simply fortunate to be a country with unusual natural resources. While that may be true, you should also know that before the 1970s oil crises, less than half the population leveraged its geothermal resource for heating. Iceland innovated in many ways and is definitely more than just the natural resource story. Partnerships between communities and the National Energy Authority at the time enabled feasibility studies and plant design to advance. Other numerous innovations were spun off. Hot water from a geothermal plant, for example, formed what has become the Blue Lagoon, one of the top tourist attractions in the country. This site has also produced many adjacent industries in health and beauty care, as well as methanol. Next slide, please. What do I think you should consider in the talks over these 2 days? Well, planning and consent is a ripe topic. In Iceland, master planning brings together stakeholders, for example, to weigh choices and trade-offs. They remove sensitive projects, and the ones that are left, they then review and rank. In France, we'll learn that considerable learning around public engagement and consent did take place. When the Mesmer nuclear plan was rolled out in France in the early 1970s with the build-out of nuclear plants, the initiative was done in a period of energy crisis without much public discussion. Yet this country learned the importance of engagement, as can be seen with its call for community bids to cite a nuclear waste research and development laboratory. They've advanced this in this area. Next, in Denmark, we also learn about a rule that was put in place with new projects, allowing or requiring a certain percentage of ownership to be held by locals. Next slide. Course corrections are another concept to keep in mind as we talk through the next 2 days. In France, the rollout of nuclear plants already showed by the early 1980s that demand wasn't as high as it was expected. Here, the French adapted with increased exports of power and innovations in load following to introduce more flexibility in their power management. Notably today, French nuclear generation represents an important cornerstone for the EU stability as the region weans itself away from Russian natural gas. In Iceland, early overbuilding led to a choice that no new additions would be made without off-taker commitments. And in Denmark, one-stop permitting became a policy innovation that reduced time delays and brought more coherence to the review process. They also implemented policies that account for repowering that introduces more efficient and newer technology as older models are retired. Next slide, please. What about focusing events? Whether we're talking about extreme weather, cyber attacks, or geopolitics, we don't wish them upon anyone, but do recognize that they can be windows of opportunity as well to bring together widespread efforts around priorities, even as differences persist. Do keep in mind, though, that there may be limited shelf life for widespread acceptance, so use this time well, and also see that cross-sectoral collaboration and learning can provide important traction for longer-term aims. Next slide, please. When we talk about energy transitions, costs and benefits are certainly never far from mind. Now, least cost economics certainly matter, but they do not reflect all the trade-offs or priorities. Important aims and co-benefits like safety, security, reversibility, and technology leadership can matter for a community's transition, but not be readily quantifiable or valued in planning. Here, it is up to the decision makers, the analysts, and truly the communities to ask those probing questions about the assumptions and the scope of the analysis and watch that key qualitative elements are not crowded out. Next slide, please. That brings us to government. So it should be no surprise that government has a role to play, but it doesn't always need to lead. Public actors and policy can be instrumental in bridging gaps, watching fairness, and assuring that the timing meets needs. Next slide, please. If there's one piece of advice that I would offer as we talk about energy transitions, it is to cultivate agility with local expertise, capacity, resources, and infrastructure. So basically, know what your strengths are and build in flexibility and monitoring. You can approach policy and planning in an integrated way instead of with silos for energy, infrastructure, workforce, and the environment. Know that learning is part of the system change as well, and that this includes policy as well as practices. And if it's done well, cross-sectoral problem solving can leverage the mix of greater strengths. Next slide, please. So in terms of takeaways, some may say, don't fix what isn't broken. But I would say to them, consider the EU and its reliance on Russian natural gas, or the Texas market in recent years with its winter snap that immobilized the system. Others may highlight that there are many unknowns in energy transitions. That's true, but it's also true if you stand still and don't do anything. Others can say it can be complicated and difficult, sure, but build in flexibility for course corrections and don't expect perfection. Look at it as a problem solving or a puzzle exercise. Some may also say it's expensive. Let's wait until the prices are right or we have more certainty. Yet these may never come by themselves, and our markets don't fully account for intrinsic value or benefits like security, resilience, or industrial gains that are difficult to monetize. So then, kind of turning the corner on this, what do you consider? Well, there are conditions like pandemics, the changing climate, and others in which the market doesn't work fast enough or is not focused in the way that is needed. Look at your resources carefully. These include the natural, human, and built environment. Tap your strengths. Approach change with eyes wide open to adapt as you go, and stay focused on the entrepreneurial problem solving as you go. Last slide. So I'll leave you with this thought from hockey player Wayne Gretzky. We should be skating where the puck is going, not where it has been. Last slide. So thanks for your time. And as we, let's see, we can take my slides off and we're going to be transitioning in a few minutes over to Hala. But in the meantime, I'm happy to take some questions. Let's see. Hey there, Gwen. It's always good to see you, whether we're in Reykjavik or virtually.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So those slides covered a lot, I know. And it was mostly to tee up some of the thinking because you've got such a fabulous lineup of people over the next 2 days. And there's so many different directions we could take with the discussions with them. Did anything stand out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really appreciate it. And, like I said, the book, that I had the chance to sort of read and engage with you about, really, I think does a fantastic job of outlining some of these. I know that you also included in that book, I think Brazil was one of your case studies in there. And so we've elected not to include that one here because we thought maybe it wasn't quite as relevant to an Alaska audience, but that was a really interesting one as well. And I know that you've been working in Alaska quite a bit. So I don't know if you want to sort of describe some of your current interests, because I know, it's sort of, you're sort of interested in this sort of general policy space, and that's sort of wound up resulting in quite a bit of engagement that you've had in Alaska lately. I think you just went up to Nome a couple weeks ago or a month ago. Gosh, maybe it's been a little longer now. I'm not sure. Looking at nuclear microreactors too. Is that right?
Yes, and thanks for teeing that up. So I have had the pleasure to visit Alaska, I think 2 or 3 times now in the past less than a year. And I was in Nome and Anchorage in January, and I think there's probably no better time to be there then. Although I probably need to plan it better so that I can see the Iditarod race next time. But as you and I have talked many times over, Gwen, I just see so many phenomenal choices ahead for Alaska. While you've got this abundance of natural resources and beauty and wonderful culture and people, you've got some big decisions in terms of the many different directions to take. And in specifically visiting Nome, which many of you probably know is on the western coast in the central part of the state. Not only do they have some of the highest electricity prices in the country, but they're remote, so diesel is only shipped in during certain times of the year. And so I had the absolute opportunity and pleasure of visiting and getting to know the community there to understand what regional diversification opportunities there are, largely with the build out of the Deepwater port, with the potential for the graphite mine, and other economic development in terms of thinking through different kinds of energy mixes. So nuclear is certainly part of that possibility frontier, but increased wind with storage and other opportunities exist. So I think it's absolutely the right time for the governor and his team to be working with you right now, not only in a statewide strategy, but to be having talks like this.
And Kathy, one of the things, I'm actually really glad that we have this little impromptu Q&A opportunity here. One of the things that I hear, there's a lot of tension between that sort of incremental improvement. We don't want to just wait. There's things that we think that we want to be doing right now, especially in Alaska, for example. But there's also sort of that that opportunity to sort of really think further out, right? And really think about the state and the future that we want to have here for ourselves, our industries, our children. What do we want Alaska to look like, say, 30 years from now, and then really kind of work backwards from there about what are sort of some of the choices and decisions that we need to do today. So there's sort of on one hand, that incremental, let's just make some stuff happen. Curtis laid a lot of those out in his presentation. There's just things that we can be doing today that make sense no matter what. Then there's also these things that are going to take a little bit more organized effort that really require us to really think carefully about the future that we want for the state. And that's kind of backcasting. Would that be, that's something that you've sort of taught me about a little bit. And I'm curious if you could kind of lay that out, that process for how we think about these energy transitions, or how we might go about that, whether it's for a community like Nome or for on a statewide basis, right?
Sure. Absolutely. And so thanks for bringing up backcasting. It's a tool that's used largely in planning, and not everybody knows about it. But basically, I'd like to think of it as reverse engineering. So you figure out what a community or a region is interested in doing, whether it's reducing your carbon emissions to zero, becoming all renewable energy based, or modernizing with nuclear, And then you work backwards to figure out what needs to happen. What are those steps that allow you to attain that goal? So instead of forecasting, which is starting where you are today and estimating different outcomes, you're starting with the end point and working backwards to figure out how to get there. And I think it's a fantastic tool, particularly with state and community planning, so that you can have a really rich conversation across different perspectives to understand with a little bit broader learning and deeper learning what the trade-offs are to get to that end point. Because not everybody may be thinking along the same lines. There may be cost or other benefit implications that, in our own fields or sectors, we don't realize what's happening with others. So I know you and I have talked about this, and I think it's a great tool to be using potentially maybe in a community like Nome or across the state to not only have a more enriched and informed conversation with different perspectives, but ideally to enable everybody to move a lot further along in terms of understanding what may be happening than 10 years out or 30 years out. So you can use it for the shorter term, up to 2 years, or you could imagine out to even 30 years out. So it's a good tool, and I'm always happy to talk about it. I did see somebody asking about my book. If we could drop a link into the chat. I also had a final slide that showed the books too, whichever is fine.
It looks like Donovan actually did drop that in there. And actually,
Okay.
You do have a new book that just recently came out too. Is that right? So I didn't reference that one. Yeah.
Yes, I think I need to bring you with all my talks, Gwen. Thank you for mentioning that. So yes, hot off the press over the holidays, the Rutledge Handbook of Energy Transitions was released. I'm really proud of this effort. It began early in the pandemic when we all were deep in our homes working remotely. The book involves roughly 70 co-authors from around the world. And it basically sort of sizes up what's happening in this energy transitions field, because so much has been done and increasingly focused upon in the past 10 years. So there are cases from around the world. There are discussions about the topics, and it's ideal for whether you're an interested member of the community, you're a student in an energy class, or you're a policymaker like our friend John Espandola there.
All right. Thank you. Well, Kathy, it looks like we've got Hatla Hund has been able to join us. So, and I'm sorry, Hatla, Kathy's going to introduce you, but it's really fantastic to see you. I know it's late there and you've got young children, so thank you for making the time to join us. So, and Kathy, I'll turn it back over to you to introduce Hatla.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gwen. And Hala, it's great to have you join us. I'm not sure everyone has had the pleasure yet to meet Hala. I got to know Hala when I was doing my doctoral research, and we were talking a lot about my visits to Iceland, and she was helping me out, particularly with some very valuable Icelandic reports for which I was not able to read all of them completely. But we've done a lot since then. And I'm really pleased to introduce her. She is the Director General of Iceland's National Energy Authority, and she teaches an Arctic course at the Harvard Kennedy School. I could read this incredible bio that she has. I know you all have it in your packets, and I want to ensure that we have a lot of time to talk with Hala. So Hala, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, and wonderful to be here with all of you. Always great to see familiar faces and to meet new ones. So I'm going to start sharing my screen if I can. Let me see. Continue. Voila, here we go. All right. You should be able to see this.
We can.
Voila. Okay, so are you ready?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to talk a bit about Iceland's energy story. I'm going to talk about the past, but also where we are now. What are the challenges we're facing as we strive to become the first oil-free country in the world? But Iceland is on the top of my list. But as you mentioned, Kathy, I have a big Arctic heart. I have to say, I visited Alaska once when I was giving a talk through Guan as well. And I was almost ashamed to say that it was almost as more beautiful than Iceland, which is very hard for an Icelander to say. So, but one of my favorite visits in the past. But here in Iceland, I'm very much focused on this goal that you can see here in the center of this picture. This is a representation of Iceland's energy policy. It's a policy that kind of combines a lot of different elements, but the heart of it, the true core, is the fact that we want to make sure that we complete our energy transition by 2050. And even in the current coalition government agreement, this goal has been moved forward. It is now 2040. So it's a big task, especially because technology has not yet developed as much as we need it for aviation, for an example. But we strive to prepare to make sure that when the technology is ready, we can implement it and get rid of as much oil as possible. All right. We have quite a unique situation in Iceland already today. 99% of our electricity is produced from renewables. 9 out of 10 houses are heated with our friends, the volcanoes here in Iceland. And that means that overall, 85% of our primary energy comes from renewables. So when we're looking at Iceland's energy transition, completing that transition, a lot of work has been done. But we're really focusing on the final 15%. And those final 15%, again, is transportation, aviation, and the shipping industry. These are kind of the 3 pillars that we are focusing on now. Where does our current renewable energy come from? I mentioned the geothermal piece. That is a big part, especially because, again, most of our houses are heated with geothermal energy. We also produce electricity from that. But hydropower is then the biggest pillar. And our energy mix is kind of unique. Most of our energy is consumed by heavy industries. The aluminum sector is big in Iceland. If you think about the general use, we're talking about 4 to 5% are households, 15% are traditional businesses. But again, the final 80% is heavy industries. And there you have, again, the aluminum industry being the biggest consumer. A bit about how the transition happened. How did we take the steps that our current success builds on? Well, in the case of hydropower, it started pretty small. We had about 200 small hydro power facilities across the country. Those were usually built by farmers. From the farm that I'm from in the southeast of Iceland, there are like 3 little farms that were kind of connected together through one of these small plants. But then later on, with the industry, by attracting larger industry to the country, the grid was built that you can see here, and kind of our infrastructure around that. So we can say that the aluminum industry played a big role when it came to kind of help us fund the constructions of these developments. And currently the transmission and distribution systems are owned by the government and municipalities in some cases. All right, so in the case of geothermal, the story is a bit similar. It started small, but it was not a perfect world when we started. This is actually a picture from the city that I'm based in right now. It's a picture from Reykjavik in the early 1900s. And you can see this cloud looming over the city. This is smoke from fossil fuels that we used to heat at that time. And then a few decades later, this is the situation. Again, we have implemented the district heating system. So we're using the heat to warm the houses. And you can see how much it has changed just in terms of air quality. How it happened in the case of geothermal, just like with hydropower. And I have to say, how these journeys start is actually my favorite part of the story, because it was all about entrepreneurship. Also, in the case of geothermal, it was about a farmer that found a way to connect his farm to a neighboring hot spring. You know, that there was success in that project, and the development took off. What helped here is that there was fuel shortage during in the early 1900s in the context of the First World War, that kind of pushed Iceland, being a remote island, to look at different options. And the first projects, every big journey starts with small steps. And the first projects in Iceland were about, heating a public school, one building, heating the main hospital. And from those kind of successes, those small projects, more development took over. It was like a proof of concept, if you will. And you know what? Already in 1938, this had become an election issue. This is a picture from one of our main newspapers still today, called Morgunblaðið, from 1938, that says, "Vote for geothermal." And you can see on these pictures that, one of the key arguments was about air quality. It was vote for cleaner air. Of course, this is long before climate change became a central issue. So we can say that what drove the energy transition at the time were energy security, having access to lower cost energy, and then the fact of air quality. All right, so we had another crisis, another energy crisis that really pushed Iceland in the direction of developing its local resources. The oil crisis in the 1970s. And during those crises, there were extremely high energy costs, and it was very difficult to rely on imports for Iceland. And that meant that the government at the time decided to put a strong focus on developing our local resources. And you can imagine it has quite some similarities to the situation today. If you think about the energy crisis in Europe, there is an energy crisis. And if you look at the EU policies, the policies of the European Union, you can see the big push towards making Europe energy independent, developing now the local energy resources. And, one says never waste a good crisis. And hopefully both the war that we have in Ukraine will end sooner than later. But I also hope the lessons from this period will mean that we will have much more focus on renewables and energy security. Was this an easy task for Iceland? Absolutely not. Some people say, well, you have all these volcanoes, or you have some hydropower, or whatever it is. But the thing is that, at the point in time that Iceland was in its journey, we had just gained independence. We were in the early days of independence from Denmark, and we were classified as one of the poorest nations in Europe. And geothermal was not a mainstream technology. It was one big entrepreneurial adventure. You can see this picture here on the screen where different farmers are building some of the infrastructure. It was a major undertaking that involved a lot of risks. And it was in some ways often easier to just rely on the current system. But funding played a central role in this, funding from the government. And how did this funding scheme work? Well, it is through a fund called the Icelandic Energy Fund, or often referred to as the Drilling Mitigation Fund. And this Drilling Mitigation Fund provided over 350 loans to municipalities across the country. And through that funding, 20 different heating systems, district heating systems were built across the island. And guess what? These district heating systems, there's still something that we rely on today, showing us once again how important it is to invest in the right infrastructure, because infrastructure has such a long lifetime that if we invest in, something that will not serve climate goals or something, it really has a long-lasting impact. But the way that this funding mechanism worked, why it's called the Drilling Mitigation Fund, is this way. If a municipality got funding to drill for geothermal, and if the drilling failed, meaning that there was no hot water involved, a part of the cost, about half of the loan, was cancelled. And they didn't have to repay that part. But if the drilling was successful, then this amount, the funding turned into a long-term loan. And through this risk mitigation, municipalities were more willing to actually say, okay, let's do this, let's try this. And of course, like with any transition, the success of others, of some led to, advocacy for others to try out the same. So, seeing is believing. Really seeing that things worked was also an important factor for municipalities to seek for this funding and actually taking the risk of drilling by having this cost cancellation mechanism. Okay, are you still awake? I can see some faces on the screen. All right, so you can see here how kind of oil was phased out. Oil and coal, oil is in gray and coal is in yellow over time as geothermal was developed and hydropower as well. And you can see on the right, the different geothermal plants that were built in steps. So you always have a kind of step-by-step increase with each project. Was the investment worth it? Oh, yes, absolutely. Whether you look at the cost difference in heating with oil versus geothermal, or if you look at the savings in terms of how much we've saved by heating annually through geothermal versus oil as a percentage of our GDP, the benefits in terms of economics has been enormous. And of course, I'm not even calculating here the energy security piece of it, right? Being energy independent, which has been a major factor during this crisis that Europe is going through right now, is the fact that we have kept stable energy prices by being able to rely mostly on our local resources. But there are other benefits, of course, which are incredibly important, which is the climate component. The fact that we're developing local renewable resources, and that, while that was not the central argument in the beginning, focusing on cleaner air, as climate change had not become a central issue, these are, of course, a major fruit of the development. The fact that we are relying on resources that are green and do not provide the same pollution. Additional benefits? Well, multiple. We became experts in a technique in developing geothermal, and we have been exporting that knowledge through projects, through education across the world for the last few decades. So you can see some locations that Iceland has worked in on this map. Innovation has been a major piece. As with any big transition, there's a lot of unintended learning. And one of the flagship learnings here is our Carfix project that actually turns CO2 into stone in less than 2 years. And this project has recently won 2 Elon Musk prizes. It won the largest funding from the European Innovation Fund and is really taking off. We are building what is called the Coda terminal, which means that we will be importing CO2 to Iceland, injecting it with this technology into the ground where it turns into stone and is safely secured. So a lot of exciting innovations that no one could have imagined now taking place in the country. Just to give you some more examples, geosilica here is a food supplement. So I often say that we even eat the geothermal. You have a cream here on the right, the loads of geothermal creams that keep us young and healthy. Food production, greenhouses, a major thing in Iceland. Also very important in terms of being, being an isolated community, being able to rely on our own food sources, grow our own vegetables and so forth. Very important. Fish farming, a new industry that is really taking off in Iceland, on land fish farming, whether it's salmon or something else. This is one of our fastest growing industries today and is actually expected to, grow enormously and become a central, or I wouldn't say a new pillar, but definitely a big component of our export industries in the near future. Then we have a few bananas that I just like to slide here just for fun. They're tasty, but they're few. Swimming pools, this is where we meet people go on dates, discuss politics, whatever it is. Every neighborhood in Iceland has a swimming pool. A big part of our public health is going swimming in the winter. We even heat up we have a little beach here. We heat it up. It's probably 10 degrees Celsius here and windy, but we still try to pretend that it's warm. And enjoy this little bay here heated with geothermal. All right, so I mentioned, these are all things that we have been building in the past. We have this success, we have those diverse industries. Where are we going for the future? Well, the Energy Fund still exists, the one that participated in that journeys before. And now that Energy Fund has been growing again in capacity, and it's supporting infrastructure. We've been building infrastructure across Iceland for electric cars. We are number 2 after our friends in Norway when it comes to the number of electric vehicles in the country. And we have big plans of making sure that we will be the leaders in that field. We are also focusing on different projects through the Innovation Fund, like retrofitting ships, support to be able to use e-fuels, supporting projects that can actually develop e-fuels for the shipping industry. So a lot of these pilot projects, just to prove the concept, are now the central focus areas of the Energy Fund. And to mention one new that is actually ongoing is a fact that we're also looking at how we can accelerate the car part, the focus on electric vehicles for tourists by supporting the different car rentals to buy electric cars, because if they buy more electric cars, the resale market is going to grow so quickly, and that's going to be a major factor in helping us to accelerate the public electric vehicle kind of market. All right, and this is our first electric plane that you can actually. It was supported as well through the innovation, through the Energy Fund, as well as through multiple other parties. And, it's amazing. You can just plug it, you just plug it in like your hair dryer, and you can fly away in this little electric plane. It can only fly for half an hour, so don't plan on going anywhere far. But it's again, as with any pilots, important kind of path of demonstrating what is possible, what will be possible. And Iceland Air, that is now operating the domestic flights in Iceland, is actually focusing on the options and has partnered with companies that allow us to implement or may allow us to implement electric planes for the domestic flights, because the distances in Iceland are perfect for electric planes. Of course, we have, just as in Alaska, you have small issues like weather and all kind of things like that. But, it could be something that could really change our opportunities in traveling within the country, because flying is really expensive. And it's could be an opportunity for us to think about, different communities across the island having the same opportunities as the capital. All right. So a few words again about the energy crisis. We've been advocating and we've never had as much interest in geothermal as we have now in Europe. There is, of course, related to the energy crisis, very big focus on local resources, given the war in Ukraine, and given the fact that heating is such a big part of the energy mix in most energy markets. And with heat pump technologies and so forth, you don't need very high temperatures to actually utilize geothermal. You don't need volcanoes at all. You just need, the right technology combined with some heat feasibly to be able to utilize the resource. So we've been partnering with countries across Eastern Europe and many others, and it has actually been taking off. The Netherlands are using it for greenhouses. Denmark is using it in Aarhus, building a district heating system. And again, if you look at the geothermal potential in Europe, which is, you can see the darker the color is, the more geothermal potential. It is considerable, and many players are now really seriously looking into how can we, take advantage of this local, secure energy baseload source that can help us provide a better energy security. All right, I think this marks the end of my lecture. I hope we have some time for discussions. So I just say thank you and looking forward to receiving some questions.
Okay. Well, great. Paula, it's always wonderful to see you and to hear more about how things are going in Iceland. We've got a few questions coming into the chat box there. Everyone continue to add yours. I will kick it off, though. It's been fascinating to see how a society that has already progressed more than most in clean and low carbon energy continue to innovate. So, Hala, what do Icelanders know today about energy transitions that they might not have known about or thought about a few decades ago? Kind of a really big picture thinking question.
I think one of the things is that everything happens in steps, right? I think if you look, I think that's such an important thing about any energy transition is that, you may think, heating just one building or doing this one project, it's so little that it doesn't matter. But the fact is that, these steps are often stepping stones to a much bigger journey. And I think that's one of the lessons when we look back is that actually, that one hospital or that one public school, it really was a proof of concept. So, you have to start somewhere with a big energy transition. And, one should not undermine the meaningfulness of each and every step.
Okay, great. I see a question here from Adriana de Villa Garay, who asks, Hala, do you know how much time of charging was needed to power the 30-minute air flight?
I have to admit, I'm not sure, but it's not that long. I think it's only a few hours time, but I can tell you that it can fly for half an hour. And for the first flight, it had first the president of Iceland and then the prime minister. And people were kind of crossing their fingers, especially after the president took off. He was about 10 or 15 minutes, and then the prime minister. So again, but everything worked smoothly. Today they're kind of doing more tests and seeing how it operates. It's magical to see how silent it is. It's
Sure.
completely different experience. But I'm sorry, I'm not sure exactly about the charging time.
That's okay. Having spent many good trips in Iceland and talking about its history with the renewable adoption, I fully understand Gwen Holdman's question here, and she asks it as a good energy expert would. She has a question about the grid connecting Iceland to Europe. And so, Hala, you will probably remember that multiple studies have been done over the years to figure out through a subsea cable how Iceland could be connected to the mainland continental Europe in order for some of Iceland's surplus electricity, in particular, its clean, low carbon energy, to be sort of integrated into continental Europe's energy mix. But it has never yet been done. And so Gwen asks whether this tie to the market would potentially raise costs. And maybe you can just expand a little bit more on that for everybody.
Yes, excellent question. So you're right. It's been now discussed, well, for the last decade or so, whether to build an interconnector or not, and what the implications might be. First, let me just emphasize that Iceland is exporting a lot of its electricity through aluminum exports. So we import the ingredients, the bauxite, and transform it with electricity into a product, the aluminum, and then export it. So one can say that we already are a major energy exports compared to our size, of course, which is, we're usually good on things per capita, at least, since we're so few. But the question around the subsea cable has not been very high on the agenda right now. There is, especially after the changes in the energy markets in Europe, there's so much demand for being located to locate your productions in Iceland. And I would say that if you look at the energy needs for the energy transition, there's going to be, quite a massive need for energy when it comes to aviation, e-fuels, and for the shipping industry. And the political dialogue is now about utilizing the energy locally to produce those fuels, exporting some of those fuels, but not doing it through direct sales through an interconnector. Well, you asked about the prices. Right. Of course, if Iceland had been a part of the connected through an interconnector, it would have impacted our pricing. Prices would likely have, increased during the current crisis. And we saw that in Norway, for an example. So one can say that we kind of benefited from being isolated and having our own stable sources during the crisis as it is today.
Okay. So we've got a question about CarbFix technology, and Isabel asks, can you give us a 30-second description of the process? 30-second description of the process is basically, it's basically, and I'm not an expert on this, so they're basically kind of dissolving CO2 like through sparkling soda water, turning it into stone. And the key here is to have basalt. You need basalt rocks for the conversion. And the younger the basalt rock is, the easier the transformation is. So what is interesting in the context of CarbFix is the fact that you can utilize the technology, in so many different parts of the world. I encourage you to go to their website and kind of look at your own region and see, okay, will the technology be feasible in my location? I will also say about the CarbFix project is that the current process requires a lot of water, but they are in the process of exploring, and the first kind of outputs of that research show a positive sign that you can actually use seawater
instead of fresh water. And if that's possible, then the possibility to use this technology, in many more parts of the world where there's less water becomes more feasible.
Sure. And it's a pretty amazing advance with the carbonization or solidification of CO2, I should say. And it seems like just in less than 10 years, Iceland has made enormous leaps forward in this technology. And just imagine, you and I were students not that long ago, and we were talking about how are the ways to at scale limit carbon emissions. And then Iceland comes up with this really cool process, which is, solidifying the carbon underground. The scientists were thinking it was going to take hundreds, if not thousands of years. And Iceland was able to do it in less than 2 years with some of the early demonstrations. So it is such a fantastic step forward that I'm really happy to see that more places are engaging with Iceland on this count to see what they can be doing where they are. As you did point out, basalt makes a big difference in this space, but I do see that they're innovating in ways where other regions can be doing it as well.
Yeah, a lot of parts of the world have that type of rock that can be, where projects can't be located. But I think you're pointing out an interesting fact, which is, again, when you go through an energy transition, or whether it's geothermal or solar or whatever the technology is that you're working on, there's always going to be some new things, new questions, new possibilities that come up. And in the case of Carbfix, it's a project established by our largest geothermal producer that is actually owned in majority by the city of Reykjavik. Mm-hmm. And they, in collaborations with researchers, amongst others in the US, started this as a research project, right?
Right.
And the inspiring piece is that during the economic collapse, Iceland really suffered, and the companies, publicly owned companies, were making hard choices. Should we cancel this or keep this, and so forth? And they decided to continue with this little innovation project. And again, as with any big journey, it starts somewhere. And I would say that, Carbfix is another interesting fruit of such a development, as are other projects that kind of were not originally designed to be what they necessarily are today. So I think these type of innovations are things that make me so hopeful, It's
sure.
And we can see these innovations. Iceland is one example, but really with all countries investing so much in clean tech today, one has to remain hopeful that magical innovations will also come about that will allow us to accelerate the transition.
Great. Now, not only from your talk, but for those who have already been reading up about Iceland, it's clear that there are many huge advances there already completed with net zero goals and national energy security. But maybe you could elaborate a little bit on energy challenges and uncertainties that you're facing today as head of the National Energy Authority there.
Great question. So, yes, a lot of things have been done, and we're kind of, basing our successes in many cases on decisions that were made decades ago. Another thing that always keeps me focused, the decisions that we make today, they may not bear the fruits tomorrow. Things in the, whether it's building infrastructure or, implementing new solutions, things take time. But where are we now, and what are the biggest challenges? So I would say there are multiple challenges. One is the fact that we are really trying to decarbonize sectors where the technology is not fully advanced. We don't know how green aviation will exactly look like. It's not a mainstream thing today. So one can say that, it's an area where the technology is not fully developed and we can just implement it. The same applies to shipping, a lot of the global infrastructure and a lot of the decisions which technology will win, which type of e-fuel will win, and so forth. We don't exactly know these questions, but still we're kind of starting with pilot projects just to be ready to scale once things become even more secure or more known. And then, of course, it's in the context of Iceland, it's also the question of energy production. We're now in the process of developing wind policy kind of frameworks, both on land and offshore, kind of more focused on land. Now, we have very little wind power in Iceland. We have great conditions, but not so much wind that has been installed yet. And it's controversial. Iceland has beautiful nature. It's one of our key trademarks. So how to make sure that we go about development correctly? How do we make sure that we do it in a way that, we don't eat all the cake in one bite, but we take sensible steps and so forth? These are really challenging questions in terms of political debates. So that's one of the things. And it remains to be seen how this will play together in the context of future hydro and geothermal, because of course you need baseload in many cases with wind power as well. So it's a lot of different things to figure out. So those are examples of some of the challenges that we're facing. But I think the beauty of small communities is that distances are not too far, and I think people are really keen on finding good solutions and trying to do so in good harmony with another very valuable resource that we have, which is nature.
Right. I've seen the powerful wind or experienced it in Reykjavik, where you can almost stand sideways at a 45-degree angle and not fall. So if you ever do tap more of that wind power, you've got another important resource there. One of the questioners did ask what percentage of the overall electricity mix is represented right now by wind. And you had said earlier that 99% of Iceland's electricity is renewables.
It's very little. It's only a handful of megawatts. You can count them on one of your hands. It's just experimental projects. The government, we have like a master plan that decides which sites in Iceland can be developed and which areas should be preserved. Mm-hmm. And the two projects have gone through that process and been kind of approved by the parliament. And now one of those processes is kind of in the licensing process as things stand. So the first wind power plant will likely rise in the next few years here in Iceland.
You brought up master planning, which is a really important topic, especially in community-informed decision-making and consent-based siting. And I had the opportunity to witness about 3 of the stages of master planning that took place over the last 10 plus years or so. Can you elaborate a little bit for everyone on where that process is right now in terms of next steps and maybe what's been learned from it so far?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just to kind of give you a background on why there was a creation of a master plan, the energy projects development, whether it's, all of our production here is renewable production, but it has still, especially when it comes to larger hydropower plants, has been quite controversial. And the origin of the master plan was to create like a holistic evaluation of different projects, evaluating them from the perspective of economics, from the perspective of culture, from the perspective of nature conservation and so forth, and try to kind of rank them, whether they should be, these different options should be developed or preserved, to kind of see things holistically. So the first phases of it were approved, but then it took a long time to approve the latest phase that was actually just approved last year in the parliament. And those have been very difficult processes, but one can argue that it's the plan the projects that have gone through the master plan, that they are more, what can I say, less controversial than others that haven't. So I would say that the plan has been successful when it has managed to, when the parliament has managed to make a decision, but it has been at times tricky for the parliament to actually agree on a conclusion. And that has become one of the criticisms of the process. And the coalition government right now has the focus of trying to redesign some of the legislation so it will make sure that the timelines do not extend too much.
Okay. Randy Hoffmeister has a question about the average depth for geothermal wells in Iceland.
But 1 to 2 kilometers or something like that.
Okay.
I have the average figure in my head, but yeah.
Sure. Okay. Then Gwen Holdman also asks about the difference between large industry and small businesses in the residential market. Specifically, you've already pointed out that a lot of the electric power in Iceland is used to support that large industry, and it's on the order of something like 70%. So how does this affect the cost and supply for Icelandic-based small businesses and the residential market? And just to add on to that, what are Icelanders' perspectives today about inviting the aluminum industry? What value has that created for the country?
Mm-hmm.
So feel free to answer all of them, or I can ask them again if you want.
A lot of good questions bundled together.
We could unpack them.
It's fine. So
okay.
in terms of the perception of the aluminum industry, the focus of our national energy company, Landsvirkjun, has been diversifying the buyers group. So we've had more data centers and more other types of industry in the last decade or so. And there is continuous dialogues about, different parts of the community. There's some opposition to the industry and some not. I think in general, what the industry has done is that it has made sure that we built the current infrastructure, the grid, the transmission and distribution system that we have across the country today. And it has actually, these big consumers have provided quite a lot of revenue for the government. I was just actually at the annual meeting of Landsvirkjun, where they were talking about how they renegotiated prices with the aluminum industry. And now today they are paying dividends back to the government. There are different aspects of it, but it has been an important part of our exports. In terms of the pricing structures, households are about 4 to 5% and of our energy consumers, and then you have 15%, which are the smaller business or traditional businesses, like businesses that are not heavy energy consumers, if you will. It used to be that they paid higher, the households and the smaller businesses paid somewhat higher prices than the heavy industries. But right now, it has been changing. So actually, we have seen through the last decade or so, and maybe not full decade, that the prices to heavy industries have been increasing, but the prices for homes have been relatively stable.
Okay. Mike McElhaney with the Department of Energy asks if you can talk a little bit more about other ways that Iceland could leverage the technologies that you've highlighted with some of the other Arctic states. So just to build onto that, what partnerships maybe do you have, and what are you seeing with the domestic industries in terms of consulting perhaps with other Arctic states?
Great question. So I think in the context where there is potential for geothermal, even with the heat pumps or smaller systems, definitely an area for collaboration. And we can see that we're collaborating with Norway, for instance, which is not like a geothermal country in that context already, when it comes to working on projects in the context of the Eastern Europe and so forth. So I would say that's one area. We also have technology that relates to grid reliability. A project, interesting project that is called Lake Power, which kind of a measurement equipment to help enhance grid security. So that's another kind of potential area of collaboration with technologies from Iceland. Carfix is a third example, which I think is going to grow a lot in the coming years, and so forth. So I would say those are examples of like technology that could be discussed. And then we have in the West, we also have smaller isolated systems, where there's a lot of similar challenges as in many remote communities. So sharing our knowledge and from those and learning from others is an opportunity. But I will also say that I think another area of collaboration is kind of how do you design the regulatory environment, right? How do you make sure that you develop the right kind of innovation programs and support systems? And I think, that those are, there are some lessons from those projects and policy decisions that have been very important for Iceland's journey and could potentially be very important for other journeys too. And then just to close on this question, I mean, renewable energy development, technology, all kind of things are, developing so fast in the world that there's so many things that Iceland can learn. We know a lot of things. We've done our little share, but there's so many things happening in the world that we, as being here, an isolated country, must collaborate with others to make sure that we're actually advancing and learning and not just focusing on things that we have done in the past, but focusing on the future.
Sure. I like to think that there are so many good things happening right now in the energy and environmental space that we could all be working 24/7 and never get everything done. It's just an amazing time to be having these conversations. I know we're coming up on the end of our segment, so I want to turn it back to you for one final question, which is simply, as communities in the state of Alaska consider diversifying their energy and their economic development, do you have any advice you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I guess, that there should always be a room for mistakes in a process of experiments, mistakes and collaboration. It's not necessarily that you'll figure everything out in the first project, but there's definitely going to be a whole lot of learning to implement in others. And I, just as an inspiration, I was just in a very high volcanically active temperature zone here in the north of our country, and they were talking about that when the north needed geothermal, they picked this area, and when they were drilling for geothermal, an eruption started. What a barrier! An eruption just right. That went on for some years, and there was still so much learning from the process. And now we're working with colleagues of Gwen and in Alaska and people from around the world looking at the learning from that and what it can mean in other locations. So even the biggest barriers can turn into opportunities. So a bit of resilience and collaborations can actually mean a lot of things, and things don't happen overnight. The fruits will come. We just have to hang in there.
Those are great words, Hala. I have to say, approaching this topic of energy transitions from kind of a collective problem solving or puzzle resolving strategy, I think is really key. And I want to say that you, Gwen, and I have to meet up somewhere, wherever that midpoint is, maybe, or just maybe it's in Reykjavik for the next big conference there in October. But thank you for your time and your insights. And I'm going to turn it back to Gwen then.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to add my thanks, Hatla. You know, you are one of the most interesting people that I know, and you just have such amazing insight. So I feel really fortunate that you were able to sort of take some time here today. And so we're just going to go ahead and go into a break, and then we're going to come back and sort of continue the conversation about Iceland in a little bit here and some of the benefits this energy transition has resulted in terms of innovation and small business support with Erlinger Gudleifsson. So thank you. We'll see you soon. Okay, welcome back. For this next speaker, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into Iceland and how Iceland has leveraged affordable energy to support innovation, small business development. I wanted to do this deeper dive into these sort of ancillary benefits that have resulted from Iceland's energy transition, because I really view Iceland as, of these 3 examples or 4 examples that we're really tracking during this workshop, I think Iceland really has the most similarities to Alaska in terms of small size and you know, many different aspects related to that. And so I really wanted to take this time to do a little bit of a deeper dive. I do think that there's this opportunity to build up more connections between Iceland and Alaska, you know, sort of leveraging some of these similarities. And so I'm really pleased to have Erlinger Gudleifsson as somebody that's on the ground working to build these partnerships. But to introduce Erlinger and then also to moderate this panel, I first want to introduce Penny Gage, who is the Tech Development Track Program Manager for Launch Alaska. Launch Alaska has been a major partner with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power on a collaboration that we call the Arctic Regional Collaboration on Technology, Innovation, and Commercialization. It is a major initiative that's been sponsored for about the last 6 years or so under the Office of Naval Research. And it's really designed around helping build capacity in both the public sector, so the university, and then also the private sector. That example is through small innovative businesses that Penny works with through Launch Alaska's Tech Deployment Track on a daily basis. And those are companies that are really focused on sort of these energy transitions or food, energy, water transitions and transportation and how those technologies could be deployed in Alaska. And so we've got Penny here for the moderator for this particular presentation, but then we've also got Isaac, who's the executive director of Launch Alaska, that's going to be joining us for the wrap-up panel tomorrow as well. So thank you so much, Penny. I appreciate your time here today, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Gwen. We're so excited to be a part of these workshops. And as Gwen mentioned, our CEO, Isaac, will be participating tomorrow. So you have 2 of our team participating here this week. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Yak'e, Yagi, and Tlingit, good day. We are so excited to welcome Erlinger with us today, who we'll meet in a moment. He's based in Reykjavik, Iceland, and has been with his current position with the University of Alaska Fairbanks for just about a month. So you are going to meet and hear about someone right at the cutting edge of innovation and partnerships here with Alaska. So while he's based in Iceland, he works with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, works with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power as a researcher, and he's part of the newly established Alaska Center for Blue Economy, which is super exciting for Alaska and our partnerships with Iceland. And in a few moments, Erlinger is going to show us some slides. He has about 20 minutes of presentation, then we'll have some time for Q&A. So you can submit your questions as you have them in the Q&A function. And he's going to be speaking about the progress that the Iceland Ocean Cluster has made in recent years to move their blue economy sector toward renewable energy and reduced emissions. And the Iceland Ocean Cluster has worked with Alaska for years. It was one of the first sister clusters. The Alaska Ocean Cluster, was one of the first sister clusters of the Iceland Cluster to be established outside of their country. And Erlinger can speak more to his position, but it's pretty amazing that now we have someone who's based in Iceland, but working with Alaska to help bring these clusters, bring this innovation and this work together to advance the blue economy. And I think he was telling me, and when we talked last week, UAF is maybe one of the first American universities to work with the Iceland Ocean Cluster, and one of the few universities to formally partner with an Icelandic institution. So we're really excited to have that position. So welcome, Erlinger. The floor is yours to share your slides.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Penny. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Erlingur Guðleifsson. I am a senior researcher at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I am located at the Icelandic Ocean Cluster House in Reykjavik. My research topics are mainly related to the blue economy, energy, power, and innovation. I work for the Alaska Center of Energy Power and, as Peggy said, the newly established Alaska Center for Blue Economy. Today, I'm planning to give you two stories, both related to Iceland's blue economy. The first story demonstrates a complete and successful energy transition where investments were made to reduce significantly oil usage for steam boilers within the fish meal industry, where that industry can now fully operate without any fossil fuel. The second story is a story of ongoing energy transition within the port of Reykjavik, where high-power electrical connections for ships at berth have been lacking. On the 13th of June 2021, the Icelandic Parliament put in act laws to ensure Iceland's carbon neutrality before the year 2040. This was to fulfill Iceland's obligations of the Paris Agreement from 2016. The goal is ambitious, but we can say Iceland has a head start compared to many other nations due to its high proportion of green energy. According to the National Energy Authority, Iceland's primary energy usage has just reached the goal of being 90% renewable energy. And those things add up with what Halla presented to us just earlier. The blue economy, as many other economies, are under great the blue economy, as many other economies, are under great threat due to climate change. The importance of well-being of the nature and the oceans should be even more clearer for nations where up to 1/3 of the foreign exchange can be related to the blue economy. This significant focus Iceland has had on the blue economy over the years has been driving years of innovation within that field. In late 2000, we saw turbulent times in the world economies, first by raising of oil prices around 2008 and then followed by a record fall caused by the financial crisis. I will not elaborate further on those, but increased cost of oil triggered development period within the Icelandic fish meal industry. And if I recollect what Halla has presented earlier, she has mentioned previously that many of the great achievement Icelanders has had within the energy development sector were, of course, due to crisis, unfortunately. But anyhow, the Icelandic fish meal industry is the second largest user of fossil fuel in the Icelandic fishery sector. The oil is mainly used for steam generation in water boilers and with other thermal processes. Purchase of energy and raw material are by far the two largest contributors to cost of goods sold in this industry. From the year 2000, there has been significant change in usage of electricity within the industry, where oil-fired steam boilers have been replaced with electrical boilers, but also with technical upgrades within the process itself, where we saw investments in electrical air heaters and with usage of more thermal efficient equipment and other process developments. Let me remind you of that a fish is roughly about 75% water. And when producing a fish meal, 90% of that water needs to get evaporated. Back in the days, a common fish meal factory in Iceland used about 35 kilos of oil for each ton of processed raw material. In a good year, such factory can process up to 200,000 tons of raw material that would yield to oil consumption of about 7,000 tons just for a single factory. Luckily, today, most of those factories have now adjusted their processes and invested in equipment so they can operate solely on electricity instead of oil. What first triggered this energy transition was mainly that the national power company began selling very cheap energy through new types of contracts, so-called curtailable load agreements. The national power company monitors constantly temperature, rain, snow, groundwater levels, and so on. And with those measures, they predict how much energy can be produced in coming days, weeks, and months. Additionally, there are two important factors that helps to stabilize Iceland's energy production. First is that 70% of produced electricity goes to heavy industry, where the load is really stable. And secondly, because houses in Iceland are mostly heated with direct geothermal hot water or geothermal heated water. Therefore, we see limited increase in electricity use due to weather conditions. The embedded code in the slide guides you to the National Energy Authority data center, where you can find further information regarding energy generation in Iceland. In 2006, the national power company began selling curtailable energy. The deal is that you can get energy at very low price, but the producer does not guarantee deliveries all around the year. And the electricity can be cut off with relatively short notice. How much of curtailable energy is available on each time is on the hands of the national power company and grid management. With good historical data about inflow of water into hydropower reservoirs, the national power company managed to increase sales of energy without any direct investments. This energy was to begin with mainly used by two relatively large consumers: the utility companies for district heating on cold locations where geothermal heating is not an option, and the fish meal factories. As said before, the price for curtailable energy was much lower to begin with than regular consumer prices, or about 1/4 of consumer prices. I believe this significant price difference drove some of the energy transition development that started within the fish meal factory in 2008. With increasing demand for affordable green energy, that price difference is today only half of what it was when the power company started to offer this type of energy. It is though worth pointing out that the curtailable energy price, the orange line we see on the chart, are shown without grid and wheeling losses, but the consumer prices include such losses. That skews a little bit differences between the lines, but I think we can roughly assume about 3% losses in the grid. But now back to the oil consumption in the fisheries. To show you how successful the transition has been, we have a chart that shows oil usage in fisheries over 21 years. The orange columns represent the fishing fleet, and the blue columns show oil consumption within the fish meal industry. We see that with new ships and better operational management of the fishing fleet, consumption of the fleet has gone down. If we calculate oil consumption for each ton of fish caught for the first 10 years of the chart, and then the last 10 years of the chart, we see about 21% difference as results in less oil usage. But let's again focus on the fish meal industry. Now I changed out the yellow line you saw before for this gray one, which represent export of fish meal over those years. We clearly see that there is significantly less oil usage for the fish meal industry over the past 10 years than before, where oil consumption has gone down to being about 67% less for each ton processed over the last 10 years than compared to the first 10 of the chart. This less oil consumption in the fish meal industry is directly and entirely, I would say, related to electrification of this industry and technical development. There is, though, still some oil usage in the Icelandic fish meal industry, as you see, and I will try to for you why that is. In this chart, we see average height in one of Iceland's main hydropower reservoirs in south of Iceland. As mentioned earlier, rain and snow are one of the largest contributors to water to the reservoirs, where late winter often limits how much the power company can take from the reservoirs for power generation, without running out of water later in the year, and therefore risk operational safety for the heavy industry and other users of electricity. Now I want to add to this chart blended raw material to fish meal factories using the same time scale, and let's see how what happens. We clearly see that available water for power generation is inversely proportional to electrical consumption in the fish meal industry over the coldest months. Due to that, the National Power Company has no other option than to reduce availability of electricity to users that benefit from the curtailable power agreements. For those who are interested, I've added QR code at the bottom of the slide where general terms of the curtailable power transmissions can be found in English. The result of this power cut is that the fish meal factories have to reduce their electrical consumption and change over to the old oil-fired steam boilers. I want to note that the scale of this issue varies from year to year, as inflow of water to the reservoirs is related to weather conditions. It is obvious that with investments in more hydro reservoirs and hydropower generation or power generation in general, the National Power Company could offer more energy for sale and fully support energy transition for this industry. The industry has made all of the investments for proper energy transition, but according to the claims, they can't get all the energy they need. Things are, though, probably not as simple as that. At the end, everything seems to lead to the discussions about one big question. What is the true value of sustainable energy? Remember the slide I showed here earlier, where I said that to begin with, this fish meal industry probably only paid 1/4 for their energy compared to consumer prices. With that in mind, it is of course obvious that stakeholders that rely on curtailable load agreements will benefit from overloaded energy market. Iceland has to put faith on the Icelandic Energy Authority and other public institutions to make the best possible decisions regarding how to provide Iceland with the right quantity of electricity. With those words, I conclude my coverage of the energy transition in the fish meal industry here today. Next, we will look into how Icelanders are working on to provide high energy electrical connections in the ports of Reykjavik. The Associated Icelandic Ports is a group of some of the biggest ports around the capital city of Reykjavik. In this section, my covering will mostly evolve around the port of Reykjavik. Excuse me. The port of Reykjavik serves everything from small fishing boats and yachts to large fishing ships, cruise liners, and cargo. In 2019, Iceland's parliament implemented act regarding sulfur content in liquid fuel in Iceland. In the act from 2019, it is stated that what type of fuel ships could use within the Icelandic exclusive economic zone. The goal is to limit or eliminate usage of the polluting heavy fuel oil within the zone. Though ships are allowed to use heavy fuel oil within the zone, but only if they are equipped with wet or dry loop, closed loop scrubbing devices. Additionally, there is a special clause in the act that states that ships can't use heavy fuel oil while at berth in port, and therefore the Port of Reykjavik is working on to get more ships connected to electricity while at berth. Furthermore, the Act says, when available, all ships should be connected with electricity at berth in port. Implementation of the Act is a clear example of how legislation has led the way towards green energy transition. Now the Port of Reykjavik is working on how to solve that ambitious goal. The project has mainly been divided into 3 sections. We can say that the first part of the implementation is mostly finished. For years, low voltage connections have been widely available in the ports of Reykjavik. Those connections have though been limited with the national grid's low voltage specs, 400 volts and 50 hertz, where the largest connections are up to 250 amperes. Now within few months, the Port of Reykjavik will offer the first high-energy low-voltage connection, a system that can provide up to 1.3 megawatts at 400 to 690 volts and from 50 to 60 hertz. This will be, for the first time, the Port of Reykjavik can provide high-energy low-voltage connection to ships, and also for the first time, ships with fixed 60 hertz electrical system can get connected to electricity in Iceland because of the 50 hertz grid that we have. Cost of the project was estimated to be about $1.4 million for the high energy low voltage connection. In December last year, the Port of Reykjavik achieved a great milestone when for the first time in Iceland, a ship got connected to high voltage connection. The project was a collaboration between community stakeholders, both private and public. The connection was aimed to mainly serve 2 newly built container vessels that are owned by Iceland's largest shipping company. According to the press release, it is estimated that this single connection can save up to 240 tons of fossil fuel annually. That yields to about 750 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. The third and last milestone of the implementation plan is to provide high voltage connections to cruise liners. Cruise liners mainly dock at 2 locations in the capital area, which makes a challenge when it comes to accessibility to high voltage electricity. For the more popular and panoramic downtown landing site, next high voltage connection is more than a mile away. That is particular, not the greatest issue, but they have to paw the cable down through densest areas of Old Town of Reykjavik. To begin with, Associated Ports of Iceland have therefore decided to aim for the dock that you see on the picture, where there is slot for 2 cruise liners. The plan is to provide 2 high voltage connections that can supply up to 12 to 15 megawatts. There are few problems related to this. Generally, Icelandic utility companies charge a daily fee for the size of each connection, where the pricing is mainly in linear proportion with the connection size. Such price schemes have of course been developed around large and constant industrial consumers back in the days, but that is clearly not the case for the cruise liners. Here we can see a clear mismatch between potential usage and a fixed connection fee related to the size of a connection. During my interview with the operation manager of Associated Ports of Iceland, he told me that there is ongoing dialogue between the port and the utility company how to solve this challenge. Associated Ports of Iceland are then also looking into implementing some environmental ranking scheme that will for all visiting boats and vessels. A scheme that will favor those who use the high voltage connections. It is known that cruise liners are generally positive to such incentives, while cargo ships look more into direct energy costs, at least what the port manager told me, where price of electricity would be compared to running of an auxiliary engine. So the conventional cargo ships are more reluctant to go to the electrical connections. Today, I've mainly covered the Port of Reykjavik as part of the Associated Ports of Iceland. The Port of Reykjavik, you can see on the pink dot in the lower left corner. There are still many other ports in Iceland that are popular among cruise liners that urgently need to get electrified, such as in the Westfjords up left, in Akureyri in the middle, or in the east. Here I'm just showing the most popular cruise liner ports, but please note that majority of Iceland cruise liners landings are though in Reykjavik, or about 300 visits annually. There is still a lot of work left to be done to fully implement the meaning of the act I introduced in the beginning. Big decisions are waiting, such as urgent need to enforce the electrical ring grid in Iceland and probably much more power generation in near future. Here today, I've covered two stories within Iceland's blue economy, where Icelanders have either completed or are making a great progress in the fields of renewable energy transitions. The fish meal industry can now fully operate without any fossil fuel, but can't get all the energy they need. Therefore, the industry is from time to time still dependent on fossil fuel. According to also, Iceland is getting a great progress towards eliminating running of auxiliary engine while ships are at berth in ports, with investments in high energy, low voltage and high voltage connections. Now, we might think, what can Alaska do to benefit from those two stories? One of the first and lowest hanging fruits on that tree would be to engage industry stakeholders in Alaska to join in a project of mapping energy usage in the Alaska fish meal industry and compare it to what has happened in Iceland. For such project, Alaska Center for Energy and Power and Alaska Center for Blue Economy could either provide capacity to either participate in such work or take the lead. And when looking at electrification of Icelandic ports, I believe no matter if it's in Alaska or Iceland, such development could lead to more jobs related to supply of high voltage electrical energy. Jobs that require skills and education that every community will benefit from. With those words, I close my coverage of the two Icelandic energy transition stories. On the behalf of University of Alaska Fairbanks, I would like to thank you all for showing interest in those topics. We at UAF believe that both Alaska and Iceland have a lot to learn from each other when it comes to matter related to energy and blue economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erlinger, for those remarks and slides. You can stop sharing your screen now.
Here we go.
Here we go. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and there is a box at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A that you can submit your questions in. But I will start out as we wait for folks to type in their questions. I have a couple of questions for you, Erlinger. The first being, so the first slide you showed was highlighting the Icelandic Parliament and their 2021 goal of setting carbon neutrality for the country by 2040. Public policy, the idea being that public policy was a big step in pushing projects forward as the first catalyst. How do you see government's role in helping move these types of projects forward in your country?
We can, for example, take another, I can elaborate on another example that did not include in those slides, but could have been fully relevant. That is what the government has providing an incentives to reduce taxes or completely take down all VAT taxes and import taxes on electrical vehicles here in Iceland, which has resulted that, the normal common people for mid and small size cars, they do not consider anything else than EVs. So that is a clear initiative and a proactive movement from the government that supports energy transition here in Iceland, I would say.
Thank you. So the two projects you talked about today, the Port of Reykjavik, the steam boilers, and the fish meal industry, you've noted they required significant collaboration between public and private stakeholders. With your role being close to both of those projects, what was challenging? What had to be addressed to make the project happen?
Yeah, regarding the development that has happened in the fish meal industry, there were mainly two factors at play there. There was a technical development. They installed the steam boilers, electrical steam boilers and air heaters. That was more an direct engineering development, plus the opportunity that the fisheries had to buy the curtailable energy. But within the port of the electrification of the port, that is, I was trying to highlight it in the slideshow a little bit, that there is a dilemma or a mismatch between the pricing schemes that have been going on in Iceland, where the pricing is mainly for those who use energy for long time and long and stable runs. But that would clearly be a general challenge, not for only those cruise liner high energy connections to cruise liners and such things. But if we are going to if you're going to succeed with full energy transitions, we will have to adapt the pricing schemes of the utility companies to fully support all those aspects. And I think that is somewhat lacking, and probably government has to have initiative there as well, because I think it's just the right way. Otherwise, it will be pushed through otherwise it will be pushed through industry, I think, and it should be a general act from above, my opinion.
Thank you. So I know this workshop was being promoted and talked about. When we think about Iceland, many of us think about geothermal resources. I think today, in speaking with you, I've learned how important hydropower is to your country, providing, as you said, 70% of the nation's power. I'm curious, though, just to not leave geothermal behind. You've mentioned that as being a catalyst and providing some of the home heating power and freeing up some of those other loads. Can you speak more to Iceland's geothermal resources and how those were a catalyst for some of these projects or decarbonization of the grid overall? And as a comparison, in the US, geothermal power provides less than 0.5% of the nation's power. It can be more expensive than others. And we just love to hear your thoughts off the cuff around geothermal energy and how you see that, especially in your role with ASEP now and thinking about ways to partner on that topic specifically.
As Halla, previous presenter, touched a little bit on, there is a heavy debate, political, social debate on what to do with more hydropower generation. So that somewhat pulls us towards geothermal, I think. And make also because most of the cheapest, if you can say something is cheap when capturing energy or generating energy, most of the cheapest options are, have already been utilized in Iceland. So that would also put more focus, I think, or lift up the viability of geothermal generation projects. I remember, just ever since I was an undergraduate student, that we was looking at assignment where you were looking at drying of fish, making fish meal, or some thermal processes related to the fish industry, and to link that up directly on a hot well or at a steam pipe somewhere or something like that. But that has surprisingly, it's probably graduated in 2006 or so. It's quite a long time since, but that hasn't happened. Why? Maybe because electricity is relatively cheap still. I've still been waiting to see, the direct usage from, the geothermal energy being pulled up from the ground and used directly in industry without going into power generation first. But I often tend to forget about, when I'm talking about geothermal energy, you start to think about electric generation, but that is maybe just a small part of it because of all the hot water. And I was so lucky to experience going on visit to Tina Hot Springs during my last visit to Alaska, and that reminded me quite much of a development that has occurred here in Iceland, where bathing sites have been, we have approximately, I think now 10 beautiful bathing sites scattered around the island, where you have the benefits of the hot water. And those are, Halla mentioned, or I think it was Kathleen mentioned, that we had the Blue Lagoon back in the days. It was established in 1985 or very, very early. It's the largest attraction in Iceland. But those bathing sites are getting, I think, among some natural monuments, the biggest attractions, and there is, I think, still some potential there. And to keep on with that let's not forget, you don't need high heat resources to do that. See what Tina Hot Springs does. There's not, it's 70, 80 degrees or Celsius or something like that, the water there. Don't remember.
Thank you. There's a question that Gwen put in the chat, which is related to what I wanted to ask about how were entrepreneurs involved in both of these projects, as well as the university system. But I'll read Gwen's question also. Can you talk a little more about the general role played by the Ocean House, and maybe talk about how that's different from the Iceland Ocean Cluster and the geothermal park, including businesses like CarbFix, as well as the renewable energy cluster? How do these organizations support private sector and innovation?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it's not easy for me, at least not on this spot, to relate entrepreneurship so directly with those two topics I covered during my slides. They are what you say, more legislation or policymakers and classic engineering projects. So with that said, we can, maybe turn our focus a little bit back to, the core of innovation in Iceland, the ocean cluster and all that. And I think that what we have there is, I've been talk about it with the director of the ocean cluster for some time, that, I think Iceland is not capitalizing enough on the know-how we have in the blue economy. Clear example was, many nations can put an electrical cord to a harbor or something like that, but the innovation regarding the fisheries and the heart of the blue economy, I think Icelanders have a lot of things to offer to others, and being located at the Ocean Cluster House is then you are in a hottest spot you can ever get. I think probably it's like a Silicon Valley for the blue economy in Iceland. It has of course, it's a metaphor, it's just a one house and so on and so forth. But it operates in a similar way. You are all located, the biggest thinkers and the largest players and the stakeholders, everything from pure IT technology to steel and to finance that can link you up. The community is, we are only 370,000, and you're not there is no problem of picking up the phone and say, I'm located at the ocean clusters, I'm working on this research or looking into this and that, and people are, very helpful to provide you with information or connect you with other people. Just for example, today I met the operator of an algae operation in the Westfjords of Iceland, and I asked him, about, you have connections out in Europe to some algae farming. Can we work on that a little bit? And that was just no problem. So all, this open mind of Icelanders, how they try to assist each others, is I think, yeah, something that is really really fabulous.
And even assisting now Alaska through our partnership, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and that is we will bring that up more and more. When I got signed to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, there was a press release in the newspapers at home, and I couldn't ever imagine the reactions that I got, and they were. And I think that, people are still not, and it relates to what Icelanders can do with their knowledge within energy and the blue economy, that university in North America has realized the edge Iceland has within certain fields, and the similarities between, though Alaska is attached to the North American continent, it is, and if you look at it from a distance, and I saw it, just after 1 month or so, I started to realize it. I felt a little bit strange. They are really like, because Alaska is so isolated, and you don't recognize that, when you think about Alaska. You talk about Alaska with some Icelanders and say, they are really isolated, but people, they don't see it, unless you start talking with people from Alaska. You start to, for example, listen to the people and what are the main themes that you are talking to here today. And I've been talking with my collaboratives at the university and all people in Alaska, and that is that you are looking for opportunities. You're looking for opportunities for the state, by and large. You're looking for opportunities for the small rural areas that are, some of them related to are dependent on the blue economy, others on something else, and so on and so forth. But this is actually the same as you hear in every news in Iceland. we are looking for opportunities to enforce our society.
Yeah, we were speaking about this on the phone last week, just the amazing similarities. In the chat, in the Q&A box, there's a question from George. I'm not sure if you can answer this, Erlinger, but he's speaking about, we're speaking about the blue economy of the ocean today. He's asking about the blue economy of the sky, I suppose, and how Iceland deals with aviation emissions in the context of your national goals. If that's something you can comment on.
Yeah, that is just a problem.
Speaking of the isolated nature of our communities.
Now, for example, European Union is probably thinking about putting some fees, carbon fees on aviation. I think I've heard, and Icelanders think that is probably not the fairest thing to do towards Icelanders because we are an island, we can't get anywhere, so we need aviation. But I was, when I was collecting the numbers, the figures, oil figures for the fisheries in Iceland, and you saw that how oil usage in the fish meal industry just gone down to being almost nothing, but relatively, what has happened for the fishing fleet, you can't say the same story. There is only 21% decrease in energy usage within the fleet. You look at why that is. Okay, the fish meal factory got electrified, and start using fossil fuels that obviously then cut off their oil usage, and Icelanders were good to that. They had technology there. They had the know-how. It was engineering related to policy and so on and so forth. But Icelanders are quite limited when it comes to changing over to renewable energy for the fishing fleet. For example, we are not inventing new propelling engines and so on. So we are heavily, and that similar applies to aviation, I think. We are heavily dependent on that other nations will take those innovation steps for us, and we will then, use them for benefit of our society and so on. But we will have to focus on our expertise and trying to spread those stories out. So other people can learn and benefit from them. Did I cover it? I think.
Yeah, I don't know, unless we're going to start. Maybe there's a jet fuel that's powered by geothermal energy. Maybe that's through hydrogen.
That will maybe be some subsidiary of Carbfix one day. I surely hope so.
Another question from George around, I think you're asking, George, around kind of Iceland's imports and exports. How have Iceland's balance of payments changed throughout your energy transition, and how did that play into energy policy development?
Iceland foreign exchange is about 1/3 blue economy, 1/3 aluminium, that's more or less export of energy, and 1/3 tourism, roughly based. If we have, 70% of Iceland's energy, electrical energy, goes to exporting of aluminium bars. And let's say that we have after 2 or 3 years, we have a new technology that can be implemented in all airplanes and all ships. What shall we do? We have a lot of energy that's used to the heavy industry, but because of the energy is occupied with aluminium smelters or whatever it is, we can't use it to be applied on this new technology that we have, or that we will have in near future. So what would it do? What should we, for example, cut off those heavy industries and benefit from, being able to generate our own electricity for aviation and fleet? But it's a difficult question, but when people are talking about that, and I touched on it briefly in my presentation. We are, there's a constant argument that there isn't enough energy in the country, but it's in general just a question of what it's used for. I haven't seen that there has been any economic reports on what would happen, for example, if Iceland could stop importing. Let's see, in a dream, after 10 years, Iceland would stop importing and fossil fuel and can be benefit only from electricity. That would be a really interesting thing to do. But I assume that the heavy industry would be a little bit skeptical if the government will conduct such research, but the results would truly be really, really interesting. At least I would be interested, because it would assist the policymakers to make the best decisions, and that's what we are in for. We are in for good decisions, not just. Yeah, at least I am.
I agree. I think giving our policymakers information, research, data, entrepreneurial perspective so that they can be making policies not in a vacuum, but based on what will work for our communities and our joint goals. We are at the end of our time.
Research. You need also. Yeah, okay.
We're at the end of our time. I know we could keep speaking. I'm so happy that this partnership has come together, and that we'll be seeing you more in Alaska in the coming months and years, and that ACEP will be able to benefit from your expertise and this partnership. And so I know this is the first of many interactions that Alaskans on the call at least will hopefully be seeing of you. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you to you. And we're going to hear next we're going to go across the world and hear from some lessons from Hawaii. Thank you, Erlinger.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erlinger, and thank you, Penny. Really appreciate it. And Ellie, we look forward to continuing to work with you and really appreciate your interest in building these Alaska-Iceland connections. I think that's really cool that there was no notice of that in Iceland as well. There's a lot of natural kind of partnerships that already happen, and we really want to kind of continue to build on these. So it's great that we've been able to use this event as an opportunity to let people know that we've got this partnership going. And so with that being said, I would next like to welcome Chris Pike, who's going to be moderating the final session of the day. Chris is the Managing Director of ACEP's Solar Energy Technologies program, but Chris has also just been working generally in this energy space around energy transitions for many years. Chris, I remember, I think I first really got to spend real time with you when you joined me on an Alaska policy tour to Iceland. So that's a good connection here, just shortly after, while you were finishing your master's degree in technology and environmental design. And you were also really instrumental in working with the Alaska Energy Authority on the State of Alaska Emerging Energy Technology Grant Fund, particularly with the instrumentation and data collection part of that program. I really noted, Hatla's comment earlier today about sometimes you have to be willing to take risk and make space or accept that some things are going to result in failures. And that's sort of that path of sort of taking steps forward along developing an energy transition. And that Emerging Energy Technology Grant Fund was really intended to do that. I hope that's actually something that we might be able to resurrect at some point in time. So I appreciate you taking the time to moderate this session, especially with your connection to solar energy. And Rick, I know that Chris is actually going to introduce you, but I want to give a warm welcome to Rick. We're actually spanning 11 time zones for this workshop, which has been quite a challenge. And Rick, you are the only person that we can say is to the west, I think, of most or all of us in Alaska. Although I will say that one of our little fun facts that Alaskans like to share sometimes is that Alaska is actually the furthest west state in the U.S., as well as the furthest east, because we actually cross the international date line. So I think Alaska is actually a little bit further, parts of Alaska are further to the west than you are. But nonetheless, you are the furthest west time zone. And so thank you. You're the only one that we can say good morning to. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris to do a formal introduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. And I'll just quickly say it's great to be here, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm very excited for our next speaker, Rick Rushlew. And I'll just say quickly that Rick and HNEI have been a great partner for ASEP going back many years now. Rick has a ton of experience. He's been involved with the renewables industry for over 40 years and has experience with solar PV, hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, as well as ocean energy systems and grid integration. He's been the director of the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute since the year 2000, and they are an organized research unit at the University of Hawaii. Currently, most of his focus includes the analysis to identify cost-effective pathways to Hawaii's 100% renewable portfolio standards goals. I think that's super interesting, especially as Alaska kind of embarks on a similar journey about through RPS discussions. And he's also working to develop and demonstrate advanced grid architectures to enable alternative energy use, as well as the development of international partnerships in the Asian Pacific region. And of course, we can even expand that into the Arctic. So without further ado, Rick, thanks so much for joining us, and take it away.
So again, thanks, Gwen. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the technical support. And I also wanted to thank Sarah and Carla for, as usual, being very patient as I was last minute submitting things and getting stuff together. So I really appreciate it. We may not be as far west as Alaska, but I think we probably are at least equally isolated, and also as isolated as Iceland. And what I'm going to do today, though, is walk through, in addition to being warmer, we are walking a very different path towards our 100% renewable. I'm going to try to give some insights into where we are, how we've gotten there a little bit, and a couple of the issues going forward. And as usual, I'm going to kind of focus on some of the issues we're trying to address here at HNEI. There's an awful lot of other things going on, but then I'll be very happy to answer questions as we go forward. So basically, we are an organized research unit in the University of Hawaii, set up somewhat similar to ASEP at the University of Alaska. And I always have kind of three big activities we work on. We do the typical university research using Hawaii as a test bed. The utility has been very good to us in allowing us to also get out there and do experiments out in the field to look at things when they get closer to commercialization. I think it was mentioned by Gwen that we've now gotten very active in the international arena, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, with funding from a variety of sources in that area. And it provides a great outlet for the lessons we're learning here in Hawaii. But today I'm really going to focus on some of the things we've done under this third bucket, which is trying to do analysis to help support the decision makers. And in that regard, we were set up in state statute in 2007, and it really put us, if not quite on an equal footing, put us in partnership with the State Energy Office and the Public Utilities Commission with a formal role for helping move Hawaii forward to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And so it's an activity we take very seriously, and we did eventually get some funding to help support that activity. So we work on that, and I'm going to kind of walk us down that a little bit. And with that introduction done, I'm going to talk a little bit here about, short review of where Hawaii is today and how we've gotten there. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I think it's an important picture to understand what we've done in the last decade or so. One of the real game changers has been, what I'm going to call dispatchable renewables, and I'll define that a little bit better, but think variable renewables with storage. That's really been a game changer as we progress towards 100% goals, and is allowing us to move forward in ways that I think a few years ago weren't really envisioned. And they're going to address a little bit the question, can these variable renewables, even with storage, do it alone? Even in Hawaii, where we really have relatively modest seasonal variability, even though we do have some. And so I'm going to kind of go through each of those three things in some degree of detail. Some of these slides have a little more detail. I'm not going to try to go into all of it. I really put some of it in for the combination of the record and, maybe being a little bit too lazy to actually remove all of it, but I think it's good to just have it in there. So, Hawaii got into this kind of for similar reasons to a lot of other people did. Initially, it was energy security. We depend on imported oil for almost all of our energy needs. We still do today. And today we still, even though we made great progress in the electricity sector, it still probably is a little bit over 60% of our electricity sector still today. Costs were also of significant concern. We were, with being tied to oil, no long-term contracts, energy costs have been highly variable. But I think as we go forward, and you see it in the legislation, you see it in the discussions, the interest in climate change and our impact on climate change is really taking a much bigger role in how we do things. And Hawaii is small, but in terms of what we do at HNEI, I like to think the things that we are doing here are really helping to provide lessons for places that might be larger, might be more significant in having that global impact. And we can help teach lessons to some other people. And that really does tie into our international efforts a good bit. So kind of a real high level look at Hawaii. We are isolated island grids. I'm going to repeat it a couple of times because people always come back and ask, but there are no interconnections between the islands. And we do have an abundance of renewable resources, although most of them are variable in nature. We have very significant wind resource. We have very good solar resource year round. We have geothermal, but it's specific to just the last island on right there, the Big Island. There may be some in the other islands. And we have other potentials, but they've not yet really been harnessed in significant ways. We do have potential for a little bit of bioenergy and a little bit of hydro, but they are really relatively small given our limited land masses. So kind of a quick history of where, we are and how we got there. I just said we are 6 isolated grids. That's on the main islands, ranges from 5 to about 1,200 megawatts peak. Each has its own unique mix of generation and renewable resources. I'm going to show one slide that highlights that a little bit. Again, no interconnections between the islands. And we are oil dominant in our generation. And historically, it was roughly about one third between electricity, ground transport, and aviation. We have reduced our electricity sector some, so that's a little bit less than the 1/3, but ground transport and aviation have been more difficult to address, and so those still remain, as pretty much in most places, petroleum dominant. In terms of a quick history, for a lot of years, Hawaii did have a fairly significant renewable energy footprint or use. It was basically the waste products from the sugar plantations, the bagasse, which was used to fire plants, provided energy to those plants, but also to the grid when it was needed on the grids. Sugar plantations slowly disappeared due to global competition for sugar and our inability to grow it cost effectively. We went through a period about 2005 to 2013 that was really aggressive growth of wind. That was really the technology that was commercially available. Those were utility scale projects. We developed fairly significant wind resource or wind generation on most of the major islands, Kauai being the exception. Around 2011, 2017, there was some legislation passed a few years earlier than that. But what happened is the aggressive state policies that had been put in place in the prior years, and primarily net metering and some significant solar tax credits, combined with high oil prices and decreasing costs of the technology, led to a very rapid growth in the distributed solar deployment. I'm going to show a couple of quick snapshots that show really how quickly that took hold and grew with the islands. 2015, we changed our primary legislation, our drivers. I think it was a 70% goal prior to that, but half of that was under energy efficiency goals, to 100% RPS for electricity. About that same time, though, we really ran into significant issues putting more solar on. The net metering and tax credit had been very effective. We had a lot of rooftop deployment. And in 2016, actually it was very late 2015, the tariffs were revised, net metering was basically ended, and the tariffs were changed to basically either prevent or limit export onto the grid during the daytime hours, which resulted in a significant slowdown of the rooftop distributed solar systems. That has started to pick up a little bit as batteries have become more cost effective, but it's still a little bit more expensive, or significantly more expensive for the individual homeowner. So it is happening, but it's still slower. What has happened, though, is at the utility scale, starting in 2019, I'm going to go through this in some detail, the utility put out some solicitations really looking at dispatchable renewables. And this is an ongoing and rapidly changing evolution in our grid. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. And one of the big questions going on now is, can we really get all the way with those dispatchable renewables, or do we, and basically most of that is variable, or do we also need more firm energy? And for want of trying to keep it separate from not being confused with baseload power, it's really dispatchable firm energy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the implications of that are as we go forward. And for some reason, okay. So just a quick snapshot on this. This is this is what the island of Maui looked like in about 2013. And if you look at the little box on the left, it's a grid that has about a 200 megawatt peak. In 2013, we had about a little over 70 megawatts of wind. There was about 35 megawatts of distributed rooftop solar. What's interesting is that in about 2009, when the integration studies were going on to look at the second and the third wind farm, there was a lot of effort going into, could those wind farms go in without there being a significant curtailment issue? The rooftop solar was at about 2 megawatts. So between 2009, 2010, and 2013, the rooftop solar went from 2 to 35. And in fact, when those studies were done, 35 megawatts was kind of assumed as an outside, limit to look at where we might be on that. If I jump forward a little bit more to where we are today, as indicated in my first slide, the wind development has largely stopped. A little bit more has occurred on Oahu, really no more on Maui in recent years, but the PV has continued to grow. Right now, there's approximately, and this number may actually be a little low, it might be a little higher, approximately 125 megawatts of distributed PV. Some of that includes some slightly larger than rooftop systems, but essentially all of it without storage. So that's pretty much uncontrolled PV on the grid. And there are currently PPAs in place for approximately 75 megawatts of utility scale PV that would be coupled with 300 megawatt hours of battery storage. And that slide number is also a little bit old. There are new solicitations out, but also some projects are having a little trouble getting on the ground. But it's a good representation of how rapidly our system has changed between 2013 and 2022. That we're looking at capacity levels of the PV and wind combined that exceed not only the evening peak, but the daytime load when the PV would be fully active. If I take a snapshot of the islands as a whole, and this is looking back just 1 year, 2021, the state as a whole is at about 33%. If you just kind of look at the pale yellow and the darker yellow, and then the green is the wind, it shows that the variable renewables on all the islands is at about 25 or greater than 25% of our total energy provider on all of the islands. On Oahu, the coal plant has now been retired, so those percentages have increased a little bit, as has oil gone up a little bit. You'll notice that on Kauai, there is no wind. Kauai has really had an issue with wind because of local bird species. Maui is very much the rooftop solar and distributed and wind rather. And you see that on Oahu, there's a relatively small sliver of the utility scale solar starting to come into play. So this is kind of 2021. It's before really the significant additions of what I'm calling dispatchable solar that the utility is now pursuing. So in 2019, the utility put out solicitations asking for dispatchable renewables, didn't specify what they had to be, but basically what they received or what was the cost-effective technologies that were proposed consisted of utility scale photovoltaic, pretty much all of the projects with 4 hours of storage, and the 4 hours is based on the inverter size connecting to the grid. And with the federal and state incentives that were in place, these projects were very cost competitive with our existing sources of electricity. So a significant number of projects were agreed upon. The PPAs were approved by the public utility commissions. Contracts were signed, and those projects are in development now. There's some interesting characteristics in general about the way those projects are structured. And it goes back to some of the issues that the islands had earlier, where if you go back to the Maui situation I talked about, the wind was there before the PV. The rooftop PV then went in, and so there was a number of curtailment issues with the wind farms that, then the utility providers become aware of because there's concern about, am I going to be curtailed going forward? So in these PPAs for the solar, the way the agreements have been structured is that the developers get a fixed monthly payment based on the expected system performance. The utility is then responsible for the economic dispatch of those units onto the grid. So the responsibility for not curtailing those systems now resides on the utility, and the developer is going to get paid whether the utility curtails them or not. So there's a lot of incentive for the utility to dispatch them in an effective manner and take advantage of that renewable resource, which is also a pretty cost-effective resource. The batteries in those systems are behind the inverters. They allow for the load shifting that can arbitrage that energy into either higher times of higher value, or just to shift load into the evenings when it is needed. It also allows you to capture the PV that's generated if it's overproducing relative to the inverter during some peak times of the day. And so those batteries play a very instrumental role in the management of this resource. The battery charging and the dispatch is restricted by the PPA. They must be charged, at least for the first few years, only from the solar, not from other generation sources on the grid. And they are restricted in the number of charge-discharge cycles that the utility can utilize. And that's to manage the lifetime. And again, that's part of the management of controlling the cost on these devices. And two of the systems are up and operating now, 2 40 kilowatt systems approximately, each with about 160 megawatts of solar. And the systems do seem to be operating quite well. So that gets us started down that path. So given the PPAs that are currently in place, where would that take us? I showed the graph of 2021 of us being at about 33%, I think it was, statewide. If the current PPAs are all executed and all go in, it will put us over 50% in the HECO system. Kauai is a separate utility. It's a co-op. They are actually at or slightly above that number already. So if you look at kind of the colors on here, you see that the green, the wind kind of grew pretty significantly in that 10, 11, 13 time frame. Has been relatively flat. There was a little bit of new installation on Oahu around 2020. There was a period of rapid growth where it was mostly the distributed solar, the rooftop solar, that's the light yellow. And then starting in about 2019, there was some utility scale solar. Those initial ones were relatively small projects, mostly feed-in tariff. And you see that the projections, now 2022 isn't quite right. A lot of those have started to come on. Well, some came on in 2022, some are delayed to 23, even 24. But over the next few years, we see growth to that 50+% range. As we have evolved towards that, and the utility currently has another solicitation out for even more renewables that would take us to higher levels. A couple of issues that have been getting a lot of discussion lately, some of them initiated by the legislature, some of them brought to concern because of some of the retirements were taking place, were issues around what I'll call firm dispatchable capacity. And that's really, if we want to keep going down this path of solar and storage, at what point does it not become effective, and what else can we do? And in fact, how much of our firm capacity needs to stay on the grid to maintain our reliability? And reliability in that regard is really our resource adequacy. And in that regard, we've done some studies around that firm dispatchable capacity. And we've also done some more sophisticated resource adequacy studies looking at really the optimal management of these battery energy systems. And I'm going to run through these really quite quickly and try to get to the results. So basically, in looking at this need for firm energy and this need for how much storage and how much solar, there's been kind of two pathways of looking at it. One is, can we select the right days, a mix of good days and bad days, and look at capacity expansion models and hopefully come up with reasonable mixes of resources. And what we've really focused on at HNEI, and it really shows up in steps 3, is rather than try to pick the right days, we have a really good database of our solar and our wind resource for the island, both spatially and temporally separated. Let's look at this large database and let's run our conventional dispatch models as many times as we need to really be able to characterize what is the expected behavior. And it can be on a probabilistic basis by running it thousands of times, or it can be a little bit more deterministic. But we still look at multiple years of weather data to look at what are the expected behaviors. And in the case of looking at the firm resource, what we did was to look at, and we did it for each of the islands, but I'm only going to show Oahu. We looked at what would we need if we built out the solar and the storage, or solar storage and wind, to a much higher level, but then looked at our weather years across this 22-year period to look at what were the periods where that resource might not meet our load needs, even at these very high capacity values. And in doing that, we came up with some very interesting results. And the graph on the left is really it's looking at continuing to grow out the solar and the battery systems, or the solar, battery, and wind systems, getting us to levels of 60, 70, 80, even 90% of our total load. And what we find is that somewhere around 70 to 90%, we start to see very significant curtailment. And this curtailment is based on, if I was putting in the new system, how much would it be curtailed based on the way the previous systems are running. So it's somewhere around 80 to 90%. It starts to become a practical limit that with the 4-hour storage, if you put in another system, it's really going to experience very significant curtailment, potentially then become uneconomic. What we did was, at each of these solar levels, run those models over multiple years and look at how much dispatchable firm power do I need to fill in the gap that solar or solar plus wind can't address. And if I look at, say, the 80% penetration level as an example, we see that the wind and the solar can get to 80% penetration. the incremental generation unit might have about 20% curtailment. But if I look at the graph on the right, it tells me I still need about 50% of my peak capacity available as this firm dispatchable capacity. So what it tells me is even though I'm getting 80% of my energy from solar or solar and wind, I still need what I'll call a truly dispatchable firm resource on the grid. And one of the questions then is, how often do you need to call on that grid? And if I look at the box up at the left, and again, I look at that 70%, 80%, and 90% penetration levels, what we find is of that 600 to 800 megawatts of firm capacity we might need, a couple hundred megawatts of it is going to get called upon quite a bit. The next 200 megawatts becomes a little more intermittent. And the final increments, either 400 to 600 or 600 to 800, are called upon less often. And I'm trying to look and see if I'm going to have one other slide on here that I'm going to. So what we find is that as we increase the variable renewable, we still need a significant amount of this firm capacity, but we use it much less frequently. And so that really opens up additional opportunity for what can we use to fill in these gaps that we get from the solar renewables. And, you know, really in simple terms, what's happening here, and it's why we really need to be looking at these multi-day periods and these multi-year periods and doing this modeling, is this is showing a good solar week and a bad solar week in 1 year when we had a particularly bad period of solar resource. And this is a case where we have very high penetration of solar. We have a very high penetration of batteries going with it. And during a good solar week, there might be short periods of time when you still need a little bit of that firm capacity. But there are periods that may be days, it may be almost an entire week, as it was here, where we need a significant fraction of that firm fixed resource. And so that's one of the issues that we're facing going forward is how do we address that? And how do we then utilize our existing systems to provide that resource? I have a slide here I'm not going to try to go over because I know time is getting a little bit short and I want to leave time for questions. But there are some options for firm renewables in Hawaii. Unfortunately, none of them are easy. The Big Island has some geothermal resource. It's potentially available on Maui, not likely available at scale on any of the other islands. Biomass and biofuels can play a role, but we have very significant land constraints, so that is not only very likely to be, but to provide a significant resource would need to be another imported fuel. We do have local waste that can be incinerated. We take advantage of that already, so there's a limited ability to expand it. And there's potential for long duration storage, which might include hydrogen. And that is something we're starting to look at in more detail now. I was going to talk a little bit about a little bit more detailed modeling that we do to look at reliability. I'm going to kind of skip over this slide, except to say, utilizing the similar modeling to what we do for that, to characterize that firm resource, we have looked at the multiple years of weather data and looked at integrating that with the random outage of the existing generation units. And what we find is that potential loss of load events or shortages in capacity are very dependent, not only on the load and load profile in the solar resource, but sensitive to the outage rates that the utility has experienced. And this one's very important in Hawaii because what we're finding is that our current generation units are experiencing increased outage as they age. We have generation units on the islands that are up to 70 years old. And so as those outage rates increase, as we increase load with the addition of transportation sector additions through EVs, we're going to need to continue to look at the potential for these solar and wind resources to meet that need. what we have done to help the community on this one is developed an easy to use tool. So we can look at any grid situation in terms of how much solar, how much existing thermal capacity is on the grid, and provide the PV developers and the community a tool where they can dial in when systems come online, and they can look at what the reliability of the grid is at different outage rates of the units or different penetration levels of the solar. We're trying to expand that into other systems as well. So that got into a little bit of detail, but these are issues that are really dominating a lot of our discussion now is what will be the reliability and what systems will we need to back them up. So kind of in conclusion, I think we're really making significant progress. We've grown substantially beyond where we thought we could get to. It's primarily been a combination of policy, but also fortuitous development of the critical technology. First, the reduction in cost of solar, but then very much the reduction of cost and availability of energy storage. We feel from our modeling that we can get up to levels over 70% of variable renewable penetration. That's far above what was anticipated just a few years ago. But even with Hawaii's consistent weather, which has minimal annual and interannual variability, these low resource periods do occur, and we are going to need to keep substantial amounts of dispatchable firm capacity on the grids. And one of the big debates that will be taking place is what types of systems do those need to be? Can we continue to use our existing units, or will we need to build new thermal generation? And how will we fuel those new thermal generators going forward? And indeed, can we get public and permitting approval to build those systems on the grid? And with that, I'm going to remove myself from the chair, and hopefully there might be a few questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rick. That was super interesting. And I already see some questions coming in here. So everybody, if we're going to have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat, and I will do my best to relay them. But I think since I do see several coming in here, I'm just going to start with some questions that are being put into the chat. One was about pumped storage. The question indicates that they were involved with some reconnaissance studies a number of years ago for pump storage, but the Hawaii utilities didn't seem interested. Could you talk about the interest of the utilities for pump storage and what kind of work is being done in that area?
There have been a number of I'm going to say utility has also looked at it. They've had different levels of interest at different times. Different groups have come through and looked at it. There is a group on Molokai now looking for at a relatively small pump storage project, actually significant relative to the size of Molokai right now. So there's been a long-term interest. I don't think there's been a convincing project at scale where, at least from the utilities perspective, they've been convinced that it was cost effective. We do have a limited number of sites. It continues to be of interest. I think what will be interesting is in the studies we're doing on this need for this firm dispatchable energy is what role does longer term storage play and how valuable is it? Because the other options get quite expensive. So it could start to make the pumped hydro look a little bit more attractive again if we really want to get beyond that 70-80% number we can do with our variable energy. So it's been around, people have looked at it. I haven't yet seen anything that's been debated as really being close to commercially viable from a cost perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, it'll also be interesting to see what the price of batteries do, since it, for a while they just kept coming down and down and down, but it seems like that's starting to turn around a little bit. Another question here is, can you talk a little bit about the electric vehicle picture in Hawaii? What is the uptake looking like now, and what's the potential for managed vehicle to grid charging?
So the kind of a couple of separate issues. So yep. Hawaii is aggressively pursuing the electric vehicles. There's a number of bills that have gone in the legislature to accelerate the deployment of charging stations. We did have state incentives on top of the federal incentives. I think they expired for a while. I think there are going to be some new ones back in place. From the big picture in Hawaii, we are an oil dominant grid. And as the models show, we can continue to put a lot more renewables onto our grid. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, if we add EVs into that mix, it increases the amount of renewables we need to get to that 70, 80%, but it doesn't really change the need for us to still have that firm fixed power. So those figures I showed, which are really kind of shown on a percent of peak load, apply even as we start to add EVs into the mix. We have looked at different charging scenarios in those figures a little bit, and there is some benefit to manage charging, moving it towards the daytime. But if we shift several hundred megawatts of load from peak to daytime with the electric vehicle charging, it doesn't give you a commensurate reduction in the amount of that firm dispatchable energy. So it actually is a very, the incentives are there. We're continuing to grow. We see more EVs all the time. I don't think it fundamentally changes the way our grids will operate. It just will increase, it'll increase the amount of renewables we can accommodate. It will decrease the amount of fossil fuels we bring in. So we need to continue to accelerate and push it. But right now, our significant barrier is getting all those renewables onto the grid. So we need to keep that going in parallel.
And I guess along those same lines, is there other work going on right now surrounding dispatchable loads? And is that something the utilities have been working with outside of the electric vehicle scene?
Other than vehicles, and there's also people looking at vehicle to grid and other ways of doing the dispatch. We don't have, there are some, curtailment projects, where demand response is the word I'm looking for. There's some modest demand response projects. There's some efforts to have some additional batteries that would provide power in the evening peak. But we don't have big industry, so it's a relatively modest component. So there's efforts to take advantage of what we have in that regard. So it is there. It's an important part of the mix, but it's not a solution by itself. Great.
We have a couple questions here about the Hawaii solar resource, which I think no one will be surprised to hear that it's better than Alaska's. But the first question says solar PV capacity factors in Alaska, with the exception of Southeast, are typically in the 10 to 12% range. I'll add quickly that that's a little bit higher with bifacial modules. What are they for utility scale Hawaii and residential scale?
On the residential scale with the fixed flat plate, they're typically around 18%, given the technologies that have gone into the system. The utility projects are reporting much higher capacity factors on the order of 27, even 28%. But you have to be a little careful looking at that number. They do have single axis tracking generally, but that capacity factor is based on the size of the inverter, and the DC panels in those projects are typically overbuilt. And so the panels themselves are probably operating more in the 22% when you do the tracking, but because of the battery and the panels working together, it's more like 27, 28 based on the inverter size.
Great. And how many generation related outage hours do you experience now? And then the second part of that question is, do you think that your existing wind solar generation has caused that figure to be higher than it would have been without wind and solar?
I think for a little while, the wind and the solar were probably causing some issues. The utility has gotten much better at managing their existing systems to accommodate it. They've reduced the minimum runs on a number of their units. There's been a couple of key retirements to basically make headroom for it. our outage rates are higher than the mainland, but manageable. In general, what we show, at least for the next several years, retiring a couple of our large generators and replacing with solar plus battery really has the potential, and we believe should increase our reliability and reduce the number of outage hours, because our single contingency events are substantially reduced in size. And that's really where we have a unit or a few units on outage for maintenance, and then something happens to one of the larger units. That's typically where we have a capacity shortfall. And in general, we've already, August of last year, we retired our single largest generator on this island, which was a 180 megawatt coal plant. The modeling shows that the solar battery is a very good replacement. The problem we ran into, and the reason we got into a lot of this work, was most of the solar battery projects were delayed. We are coming upon a couple of tight periods because of some future retirements that may be forced on the utility because of lack of parts or aging generation. And so it's critical we continue to develop the solar battery systems. But as a replacement at this stage, they're very effective at maintaining the resource adequacy on the grid.
And a question here that is kind of in line with some of the modeling that you just mentioned. Historical weather data may be limited as far as the occurrences of severe weather. Can you talk about how you're integrating climate change into your models?
So we are looking at some 22 years of solar data. It does include a number of times that storms have come through. We look at all the islands and their own weather. It does include a period everybody references in 2006 and always wants to say, well, what do we do to accommodate that? And the reality is, other than that specific week, the rest of that year was actually pretty good. So we are looking historical. We have also run the models by looking at, let's pick the worst month of every year and pretend that was our entire year. Let's look at the month that had the worst day or several days. So we've looked at various configurations to kind of extrapolate worse weather. It changes things, but not significantly. We haven't looked aggressively forward-looking yet at what climate change might bring, and that is something that longer term we do need to do, but we haven't yet addressed what those changes might be. There are certainly groups in the university looking at it and making this forecast, but we haven't yet included them in our modeling.
Great. And then I'm going to ask one more question, since I don't see, let's see, let me look real quick. Oh, let's see. Oh, there's a couple more here that I'll ask. Can you talk about the political forces and the events that precipitated the passage of the RPS in Hawaii?
You know, I think the political forces were, I mean, there was a lot of interest in, after the first crisis. I mean, we're dependent on oil here. We have a very limited gas. Most of a little bit imported gas. Almost all of it is really a gas from reformed oil. Our prices were high. Going into the 2000s period, we saw really extreme price volatility. The technology was starting to look better. So it was really those first two drivers of energy security, trying to become more independent of international disruptions and cost. There's been an evolution looking more at the climate change, but it was really very vocal cost and energy security issues that led to the early legislation.
Perfect. And I think with that, we will wrap it up and hand it back to Gwen. Rick, thanks so much. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I think it brings up some really great questions for Alaska as we kind of depart on a similar journey. So thank you very much again. And Gwen, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rick. I particularly want to thank Rick specifically. I mean, you've really gone down into a little bit of the specifics on looking at this reliability and, how you really get to 100% renewables, especially using those variable resources. And I just want to acknowledge that you've really been offering a lot of support and pulling in some of your network of partners to help ASAP and Alaska build up capacity to do those similar sort of robust scenarios modeling around decarbonization, particularly of our rail bulk grid. So we really appreciate the resources and the partnership we have through the Office of Naval Resource around Office of Naval Research around some of those efforts. So thank you. And thanks to all of the other moderators and presenters and all of the virtual attendees, especially the 59 of you that have hung on until the bitter end today, and then Sarah and Carla with Anchorage-based Government Event Services. You guys are doing a fantastic job organizing the logistics for this series. I encourage all of you to encourage your friends and colleagues to join us tomorrow. We're going to hear about both nuclear with France and wind with Denmark. And so it'd be really fantastic to have a good audience for that. We've got some really great speakers. And I forgot to also mention earlier that we have Jason Meyer, who is with the Rocky Mountain Institute, sharing some information on workforce development, especially related to their experiences with leading their Energy Transitions Academy. And Jason is actually a previous employee with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power and worked with me and Chris Pike and Aaron Whitney and others on the Emerging Energy Technology Grant Fund that I mentioned earlier. So it's really great to pull Jason back into our Alaska-based conversations through his current role. So I look forward to seeing all of you back here tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Alaska time or 12:30 p.m. Eastern time, if that's helpful at all. And otherwise, have a great afternoon, morning, or evening. So wherever you may be. Thanks. We'll see you tomorrow.